The wind over the ruins whispers, not in Egyptian nor Greek, nor any tongue known to the living. It sighs through shattered lintels and cracked pylons like the ghost of a prayer, like a lamentation carried across centuries. Where once chariots gleamed and banners of Horus flapped in the river breeze, now only reeds stir in the twilight, brushing the bones of a forgotten empire. This was Rameses, the city of the chariots, birthed in splendor and choked by silence. At dusk, when the last copper threads of sun drape the Nile like blood spilled from heaven, the air grows heavier, and if one is very still, still enough to hear the hush of one's own heartbeat, one might catch the distant echo of coughing, not the vibrant speech of merchants or the chants of priests, but the dry, rattling gasp of lungs emptied by plague. It was once the crown of the new kingdom, the jewel forged by Pharaoh Rameses II himself. But Rameses was no mere city. It was a throne upon the earth, its walls painted with the breath of gods. The streets pulsed with incense and authority, and its sacred canals bore the reflected light of a world at its height. Temples loomed like mountains hewn from alabaster. Statues of the divine, taller than a dozen men, cast long shadows upon marbled courtyards. War horses bred for conquest thundered across its boulevards, wheels of war slicing the dust. This was no ordinary settlement. It was a stage upon which Egypt paraded its divine right to rule the living and the dead. And yet, in the blink of a vengeful deity's eye, it ended. Not with fire, not with war, but with the soft, unseen hand of something smaller than a grain of sand. The first signs were dismissed, of course. A priest fell ill after bathing in the temple's sacred pool, and his skin erupted in red pustules. The scribes claimed he had angered the gods, perhaps spoken falsely in the holy tongue, or gazed too long upon the veiled idol of a moon. But then another followed, and then another. The chanting faltered. The offerings went unburned. Soon, the high acolyte of Ptah collapsed mid-ritual, and when they opened his veins in search of omens, only black, thickened blood spilled out. The Nile that had once given Egypt its lifeblood now seemed to bleed pestilence. From the rich delta marshes rose clouds of biting insects, thick as smoke and thirsting for blood. They danced above the channels like a dark mist, swarming, singing a song no one wished to hear. The people called it the breath of Sekhmet, the lion-headed goddess of vengeance. And in truth, it did feel like wrath incarnate. Children withered, midwives refused to deliver. Sacred cows bellowed and dropped dead, their eyes glassy and bloated. It was not famine. The grain stores were full. It was not war. No enemy breached the gates. It was something deeper, more insidious. An enemy within the very water, the air, the blood. Some say it began in the royal harem, that a conspiracy against Pharaoh Rameses III, a bitter web spun by his own consorts, had invited divine retribution, that the gods, witnessing betrayal from within the palace, turned their faces and let loose the curse. Others whisper that it was no god at all, but an error in man's pride, an aqueduct misrouted, a canal left stagnant, a breeding ground for fever disguised as a blessing. No scroll speaks clearly. No single tomb bears the mark of mass death. There is only the echo of absence. Archaeologists today dig through the silt and find clues rather than answers. Layers of sediment stained with residues. Strange compounds once used in preservation rites, now mingled with microbial decay. They find skeletons, but not in graves, rather in collapsed homes, curled as if in fever dreams. Some bear lesions beneath the skin, a blistered testimony sealed in linen. Others are headless, perhaps robbed of identity in the panic that followed. There are no records of evacuation, no edicts from Pharaoh, just silence. But Ramesses was abandoned not with ceremony, but with haste. The streets were left littered with broken amulets and overturned offering bowls. Gold still glittered in temple vaults, too cursed to touch. Statues of Osiris and Ra, once scrubbed daily by trembling hands, now slumped under moss and mildew, their eyes hollow with waiting. The city had become a mausoleum for the living. And still, it stands. Not as it once did, but as a haunted echo, its name buried beneath layers of wind-blown dust and papyrus reeds. Explorers have walked its bones and claimed the earth feels wrong beneath their feet, too soft in some places, too brittle in others, as though the city resists being unearthed. One archaeologist reported that while sketching a mural of a charioteer, the sandstone beneath her hand crumbled, revealing another painting below. A scene of priests dragging a corpse toward the Nile. Was it a cover-up? A ritual silencing of the plague? Or simply the desperate artistry of survivors trying to tell a story no one wished to remember? Whatever the truth, the city could not be saved. They say that, as the last families fled, carrying what few possessions remained untainted, a storm rose over the delta. Thunder cracked like the judgment of gods, and lightning split the sky into burning veins. The sacred lake overflowed, spilling fetid water into the temple courtyards. Papyrus scrolls dissolved in muddy currents, their ink running like tears. One story tells of a solitary priest, blind from illness, who remained behind to chant the final rites. His voice was said to echo for hours through the empty halls, until at last the storm drowned it in silence. Now, in the present dusk of time, only fragments remain, stones carved with forgotten names, canals lined with salt and rot, and that faint, sorrowful sound, the echoing cough that rides the wind. We look back upon Per Ramesses, not with awe, but with mourning. It was a city that soared too close to the sun, its chariots riding not to glory, but into the arms of oblivion. In its fall, it teaches no clear lesson, offers no neat conclusion. There was no final battle, no heroic last stand. Only abandonment, as though the soul of the city exhaled once and never drew breath again. So when you lie in bed tonight and the room falls still, think of the city of the chariots. Imagine its golden walls washed in moonlight, its silent temples heavy with the memory of incense and death. And ask yourself, was it punishment from the gods? Or the vengeance of the earth, weary of being worshipped for what it could no longer give? Either way, the dust remains, and beneath it, the story sleeps. Not dead, merely dreaming. They say the gods punish hubris, not with thunderbolts, but silence. And on one windless night, in the second year of the Peloponnesian War, silence fell over Athens like a black veil soaked in fever. It was not the crack of Spartan spears at the gates that undid the city of philosophy. It was breath itself, stolen in the dead of night, one cough at a time. The year was 430 BCE. The heart of the ancient world throbbed behind thick walls, its citizens crowded like grains in a jar. Outside, Sparta loomed, a storm held at bay by stone. But within, an unseen tempest stirred. The streets, once echoing with debates, theatre, and the cries of olive merchants, began to stink of something else: sweat, rot, and the copper tang of blood. They came seeking safety: farmers, merchants, mothers with infants strapped to their backs. They came because the city promised protection, because the walls of Athens had always stood firm. But what do walls matter when the enemy rides the wind? The sickness arrived like a ghost no priest could banish. It moved in shadows, rode in on ships, nestled into the breath of one, then 10, then 1,000. No oracle foresaw it. No physician cured it. It began with a fever, as if the blood of men had been set to boil. Then came the thirst, endless, burning. Some drank until their bellies swelled and split. The tongue cracked like old leather. The eyes turned crimson, then glass. And then, the madness. Thucydides, the historian and soldier, wrote it all down. He too fell ill, but the gods spared him, perhaps so we might know. He tells of bodies left to rot in temples, of holy places turned into charnel houses. He writes of fathers lighting pyres for their sons, only to fall dead atop the flames themselves. The rites of burial, the sacred coin for Charon, the prayers to Hades, were forgotten. The city of learning, of sculptors and lawgivers, became a furnace of grief. It is said that even Pericles, the great statesman, tried to rally them. His voice, once thunder in the assembly, now cracked with sickness. He watched his sons die. Then he too succumbed, like a mighty olive tree struck from within, leaves falling before the storm had even passed. Some whispered it was the wrath of Apollo, insulted by Athenian pride. Others blamed the Spartans, accused them of poisoning the wells. But what poison makes a man forget his brother? What plague makes a mother abandon her child on the threshold of a temple? Eyes already blind, mouth whispering the names of dead gods. As the weeks bled into months, the order of the city unraveled. The laws, those noble rules etched in marble, were discarded like rotted fruit. The poor burned the dead in temple hearths. The rich bribed their way into already overflowing tombs. Corpses floated in the cisterns. Rats became priests of the underworld, gnawing on forgotten bones beneath moonlight. And through it all, the city dreamed fevered dreams. The theater, once alive with tragedy and chorus, fell silent. The Stoas, where philosophers once argued the nature of justice, now held only the echo of sandals and coughs. The statues of Athena, cold and still, watched the decay with stone indifference. Reason itself, that bright flame of Athenian glory, guttered in the wind of despair. The illness had no name. Even now, scholars argue. Was it typhus, smallpox, Ebola's ancient cousin, or something lost to time, some chimeric scourge that danced for one season and vanished like a spirit sated with suffering? But its shape remains in the ink of Thucydides, in the way he wrote not with detachment, but with the haunted breath of one who had walked through Hades and returned. He wrote of the bodies piled so high the buyers could not keep up. He wrote of the collapse of virtue, of people who once praised moderation, now grasping at pleasure like starving dogs. With no fear of afterlife, no belief that the gods still watched, men became shadows of themselves. And yet, in this darkness, something strange clung to the dying city. A woman with bloodied hands still sang lullabies to a child already cold. A boy lit candles before the broken altar of Apollo, though his skin wept sores. A priest buried himself alive in a pit of lime and salt, whispering prayers to cleanse the earth. acts not of reason, but of something deeper. Some thread of defiance, or love, or madness. Athens endured. Stone can survive what flesh cannot. The walls still stand, the statues remain. But the soul of the city, that dream of rationality, of democracy shaped by logic and virtue, was never quite whole again. After the plague, the people became harder, less trusting, more prone to demagogues who whispered vengeance and power. It is no accident that within a few short decades, the trial and death of Socrates would follow. As if the gods, having wounded the body of Athens, now sought to break its mind. Even now, when the moon is high and the winds are still, if you stand among the ruins of the Pnyx or wander the temple lanes, you might feel it, that breathless hush, as though the city remembers, as though somewhere in the stone a fever still burns. No monument names the plague, no gravestone bears its title. It vanished as it came, silent, invisible. But for a time, it ruled over Athens like a dark king, and in its reign, it taught the greatest city of the ancient world a truth it never wished to learn. That no wall, however mighty, can guard against the silence between heartbeats. That reason, for all its grandeur, is a candle in the wind. That the gods do not always speak with thunder. Sometimes they whisper through disease. And when they do, even a city of philosophers will forget how to dream. The sun never rises in Teotihuacan. It emerges, yes, but not as a benevolent dawn. It bleeds over the mountains like an old wound reopened, pouring gold upon stone in silence. Shadows stretch along the avenue of the dead, cast by pyramids that once mimicked the shape of stars, black silhouettes against a sky that has long since forgotten the prayers once flung into it. The pyramid of the sun waits, not as a monument, but as a mausoleum. There is no birdsong here, only the wind, dry and flaking like ash from a long-cooled fire, whispers over the obsidian blades buried in soil, and the murals now faded to ghost paint. Teotihuacan, city of the gods, was not born of whim or chance. It was carved, stone by stone, with celestial resolve, its wide avenues angled toward the Pleiades, its temples mirroring the heavens like a mirror held to the face of a god. And yet now it lies hollow, bones beneath its plazas, silence pooled in its sanctuaries. Something happened here, something holy, something terrible. Before the silence, there was order. A city of over 100,000 souls, maybe more. A place where artisans etched jaguar fangs into stone, where priests painted with cinnabar and fire, where markets buzzed with merchants offering feathers, salt, and turquoise. Water flowed in hidden aqueducts, incense curled in sacred precincts, and atop the pyramids, rites were held under constellations. It was not a city in the modern sense. It was a spell, a mandala, a living ceremony cast in clay and fire. Every wall was prayer, every step ritual, every corridor a path for gods to tread. And then something broke. It began as it always does. Not with panic, but with unease. A child missing from the weaving stall. A temple closed at midday. A fire smoldering too long in the obsidian quarter. People whispered of dreams thick with blood and eyes without pupils. The priests, once omnipresent, wrapped in bird plumes and painted blue, became scarce. A procession was cancelled. Offerings were left untouched. Then the sickness came. There are no words left from those who lived it, only what the bones tell us. Scattered beneath the soil are mass graves, shallow, hurried, frantic. Bodies burned beyond recognition, stacked like firewood, and left beneath the shadows of walls meant to last forever. In the bones of children, lesions bored through skulls like worms. In some homes, whole families died at once, curled into themselves like they tried to hold their breath until it passed. Some say it was a hemorrhagic fever, brought by rodents, carried in the dark crevices of storehouses and temples. Not the kind of disease that flares like fire, but one that seeps like oil. Skin would blister and bruise, blood might fill the mouth, and those afflicted would die whispering to gods who no longer answered. Others say it was a revolt, an uprising from within, a purging of the elite, a burning of the priests. But if that were true, why did none remain to tell the tale? Why did the victors vanish with the vanquished? Even the murals tell of a shift. Once painted with sacred vibrance, jaguars dancing, eagles in flight, gods blooming from flames, they begin to darken. Serpents turn to smoke, faces elongate, become masks, become voids. In some, what seem to be tears fall from eyes as wide as suns. And then, suddenly, the paint ends, as if the artist dropped their brushes mid-stroke, or their hands forgot the shapes. Still, the pyramids stood. They always do. But they were no longer altars. They became tombstones, markers for vanished people. The Pyramid of the Moon, once echoing with flutes and the cries of sacrifice, now caught only the wind. The Temple of the Feathered Serpent, where warriors were once reborn in sacred blood, stood flanked by silent plazas. The Avenue of the Dead, that wide path of gods, became true to its name. By the 7th century, the city was largely deserted, a place abandoned not over generations, but seemingly all at once. No trailing decline, no long goodbye, just absence. Even the Aztecs, when they came centuries later, did not claim it. They called it Teotihuacan, the place where gods are born. And even they, conquerors and empire builders, dared not settle there. They worshipped it from afar, walking its dead streets like pilgrims, as though something still lingered, watching, waiting, remembering. It is said that plagues arrive like mist, soft, unseen, and irreversible. You do not know they are among you until they have settled in your lungs, in your water, in your gods. And by the time you do, it is too late. Perhaps it was not the fever alone. Perhaps it was something deeper. A breach in the sacred pattern, a failure of devotion, a god neglected or offended. When your city is a ritual, even the smallest crack can shatter the whole spell. Some imagine the final days, smoke rising not from incense but from pyres. The sound of coughing is louder than the song. A priest alone atop the pyramid of the sun, arms raised not in triumph but in pleading. A mother wrapping her child in feathers, believing it might carry him to the next world faster. Merchants turned back from the gates, finding the city not hostile, but empty. Teotihuacan did not fall with swords. It was not conquered by an enemy. It dies as a body dies in sleep, slowly, then all at once. Even now, under the moonlight, the city glows faintly, a breath in the stones, a whisper in the tunnels. Archaeologists dig and brush and catalogue, but they do not hear it. Not like those who dream. Those who walk the ruins in night dreams know it well. The silence that falls too quickly, the air that tastes faintly of copper, the sensation that someone is watching from behind a broken fresco. What god died first in Teotihuacan? Was it the god of the sun, of the moon, of war or water? Or was it the god of the people, the one that lives only when there are voices to chant his name? The fever beneath Teotihuacan was never only of the body, it was of the spirit, a sickness that unmade not flesh, but belief. And when belief dies, cities follow. You can burn a temple, you can bury a body, but when you lose the thread of sacredness, when the stars no longer speak, what remains? Only stone, only silence, only shadow. They say the sun rose blood red on the day she arrived, not in metaphor, not in poetry, but in fact. For the scribes of Hattusa, those cold chiseling witnesses of empire, carved it into clay. The sky turned copper, and the light of the dawn was as if stained with the blood of lambs. An omen, they said, of something too large for men to understand. And still, they welcomed her, veiled in linen and shadow, a daughter of Pharaoh coming bearing peace. But peace, like so many precious things, came with a curse sewn into its hem. The year was unknowable, for in Hattusa, time bent beneath the weight of gods. But we believe it to be near 1325 before the Nazarene walked the earth, when the Hittite Empire was at its height, and its capital sat like a heart in the ribs of the Anatolian highlands. Hattusa, city of stone and smoke, carved from cliffs and crowned with temples, where lions stood in gateposts, and kings spoke to the heavens through tablets of gold. She arrived through the south gate, with camels laden in turquoise and lapis, eunuchs carrying cedar boxes filled with oaths. The air shimmered with desert heat. Dust clung to the hem of her robes, and within her lungs, so they say, was a breath that would unmake kingdoms. She was a gift, a bondwife of alliance, sent to wed the son of Suppiluliuma I, the great line of Hatti, in exchange for peace between the two ancient powers, the pharaoh's daughter, unnamed in surviving stone, and yet the bearer of something darker than prophecy. In her dowry was gold, in her kiss, a death that could not be undone. It began, as such things often do, in whispers. A slave fell ill in the royal kitchens, then a priest, then 3 charioteers. The scribes, faithful as ever, recorded their symptoms in wedge and clay. They cough as if choked by sand. They sweat even in the frost. Their skin blackens. Their mouths bleed. The gods do not answer. Suppiluliuma, proud and iron-eyed, did not fear at first. He ordered the sacred bulls slaughtered, ashes scattered. He walked barefoot into the high temple, hands raised to the storm god Tarhona, and prayed until his voice broke. The gods remained silent. The coughing spread. It moved like wind through the stone veins of the capital, then beyond, to the villages dotting the Halys River, to the iron mines in the mountains, to the outer cities where border lords wore golden beards. No tent nor temple was spared. In time, it reached the king's own children. And still, the queen bathed her in oils, anointed her with rosewater, as if perfume might fool the plague. The people called it Namtaru's breath, the spirit of disease sent by gods, angered at the union of Hatti and Kemet. Others blamed the foreign woman, whispering she had cursed the royal line. But it was Suppiluliuma himself who bore the burden. In a letter carved not in gold, but in sorrow, he wrote, "I have sinned, or my fathers have sinned, and the gods repay me now." Years passed, not weeks, not months, but 20 long years of ash and mourning. Entire regiments were buried in mass graves beyond the Lion Gate. The city's blacksmiths, once the envy of empires for their iron secrets, fell silent, their forges cold. Traders abandoned the roads. Priests stopped anointing the altars. Even the festivals of the sun cult, once mighty processions of music and flame, dwindled to silence as the sick lay dying in the temple of the thousand gods. The princess, they say, grew pale and skeletal. Her beauty faded beneath the veil. Her voice cracked like a dry reed in winter. Yet she lived. She lived as the kings died. For Suppiluliuma would be claimed by the plague before year 10 of its reign. His successor, Anuwanda, followed within a season. One by one, the line of royal blood thinned until the throne sat beneath a sky that had forgotten how to weep. Even as his empire crumbled like sun-dried mud brick, the final king, Mursili II, kept writing. Tablet after tablet of desperate hope. The gods are angry. I have given them bulls. I have given them gold. I have sent away the unclean ones. Still, the coughing remains. He consulted dream readers. He sent envoys to far temples. He cast the bones of oracles into fire. But the answers came hollow. His final prayers read not as demands, but as pleas. The strength of empire had given way to the despair of a father kneeling at a child's sickbed. He wrote, "If I have erred, forgive me. If the priest has erred, forgive him. If the people have sinned, forgive us all." But the gods had turned their faces away. And so, when the winds changed and the plague at last withdrew like a shadow retreating from dawn, it left behind a broken shell. No war had undone the empire, no famine, no rebellion. Just breathe, just air, just the unseen hand of contagion carried across deserts on the silken hem of a bride's garment. The Hittite Empire, once a force to rival Ramses and the pharaohs, would never rise again. Hattusa, its heart, was abandoned. The stone lions at its gates cracked. The temples fell silent. The golden tablets grew cold in the dark. But sometimes, so the shepherds say, when the frost bites early and the pine trees sigh against the cliffs, you can still hear the echo of a cough in the wind, not of illness, but of memory, a dry, rasping lament that carries with it the breath of kings and the silence of the gods they begged in vain. And perhaps, if you stand long enough among the ruins, you'll feel it too. That invisible hush that clings to ancient places, that waiting, that watching. For love came to Hattusa, not in roses, but in ruin. And the empire that had spoken with gods was undone by something smaller than a whisper. The air in a woman's lungs. And when the dust finally settled over the ribs of Anatolia, there was no enemy to curse, no sword to sharpen, no war to avenge. Only silence and stone and the long, slow exhale of history. They say the gods carved Harappa from river mist and silence. That where the 5 rivers once roared through the Indus Valley like silver serpents, they poured their secrets into the palms of humankind. And in those cupped hands, something divine bloomed, a city shaped not by chaos, but by order, measured, clean, symmetrical, not of conquest, but of quiet brilliance. And yet, like all sacred things, Harappa vanished, as if the gods themselves, envious of what was made, leaned down and exhaled ruin. Before the silence, there was rhythm. Before the dust, there was laughter echoing down corridors of kiln-fired brick. The year is unknowable, the names lost to stone and time. But the streets still remember. The streets of Harappa, straight as a ruler's edge, gridded like thought itself. There were baths for ritual cleansing, deep as memory. Wells dug by hands that knew the thirst of generations, granaries vast as temples. Even their toilets, flushed with the pride of function, spoke of a people who sought harmony between body and earth. And then, disarray. They did not burn. They were not butchered. No conqueror's spear tore their banners. No smoke curled into the heavens in offering or vengeance. Instead, something invisible, something intimate, a pestilence that crept through the city like a whisper in the water. Archaeologists found them, skeletons scattered like broken marionettes, collapsed mid-step, mid-thought. A man curled beside a well, knees to chest, as though returning to womb or earth. A mother reaching toward a child whose skull bore no wound. Entire families folded into the street dust, not slain but stilled, as if some great lullaby, cruel and cold, had sung them into death. There are those who say the rivers betrayed them first, for the rivers were gods to the Indus people, givers of rhythm and seed, of flood and fertility. But even gods shift. Some believe the monsoon faltered, its song growing softer, more erratic. The mighty Sarasvati may have wandered from her course, her banks drying like veins emptied of lifeblood. Crops failed, fields withered, famine lurked at the edge of each meal, and with it came desperation, and perhaps sickness. Or perhaps it was not famine, but abundance that undid them. A paradox of brilliance. For Harappa had mastered water. Reservoirs channeled the rains. Drains carried waste far from hearth and prayer. But when the rain stopped, when the water stagnated, so too did death begin to stir. There is no record, no inscription. Their script, carved in soapstone seals and painted in ochre swirls, remains mute to us, a language forgotten before it could be remembered. We do not know what they called pestilence. We only know it came. And it lingered. Imagine it, the sacred pool at Mohenjo-daro, once filled with pilgrims and ceremony, now still, its surface green with rot, water once blessed, now fetid, and with it, fever. The kind that gnaws the joints and clogs the lungs, the kind that makes the body sweat salt, as if to become stone. Children coughing into clay bowls, priests fevered on rooftops, whispering prayers to silent skies. Every mouth parched, but the water itself now poison. And still, no war, only absence. The bones tell us the end was not swift. The dead do not lie in mass graves, but alone or in pairs, as though the city emptied slowly, house by house, breath by breath, as though families waited for dawns that never came, lighting oil lamps against a darkness not of night but of soul. They left behind their toys, carved elephants, small carts with wooden wheels. They left their tools in kilns half-fired, seals half-pressed, ovens cold. They left pots still full of grain, as if they had hoped to return. They did not. The silence became complete. And what remains? Streets that still drain when rain falls, though the hands that laid them are dust. Walls still standing without mortar, as though held together by memory alone. Skeletons still curled in final postures, not of agony, but of acceptance. A dancer, perhaps, mid-pose, a priest, mid-chant, a child, mid-dream. Did they believe the gods had turned their faces? Did they see the pestilence as a punishment or a test? Or had they no word for it at all, only the shared dread of an unseen enemy that drank from their wells and slept in their bones? There is no myth to explain them, no echo of a king's folly or a god's wrath, only the strange purity of their disappearance, the way a candle snuffs not in wind but in stillness. And so Harappa endures as a ghost of brilliance, a reminder that order cannot save us from entropy, that even the most harmonious of cities can crumble under the weight of silence, that water, giver of life, can turn traitor. Tonight, as you lie in the hush of your own room, think of them, the nameless dead who once measured the stars in terracotta bowls, who carved seals of unicorns and danced beside sacred tanks, who built without war, worshipped without blood, and yet were undone, not by blade, but by breath. Their story is not carved in stone. It is whispered in ruin, in bone, in the hush that follows brilliance. A pestilence came, unnamed, unseen, and took the song from their mouths. And still, beneath the dust and roots, their city waits, whole, silent, dreaming. It was the spring of 541 in the reckoning of the empire, and Constantinople gleamed like a chalice lifted to the sky. Justinian ruled from his palace of porphyry and marble, dreaming Rome back into breath, clawing lost provinces from the jaws of memory. His was a reign of ambition. Cathedrals rose like stone prayers, laws were ordered like stars, and armies marched to rebind a broken world. But even empires built by divine right cannot outshine what crawls in the dark corners of fate. In the beginning, it was little more than a rumor, a sickness in Egypt, something minor, something distant. But the roads of the world all bent toward the Bosporus. The merchants came, the grain ships docked, and with them the rats, and with the rats the plague. The first to fall were the invisible ones, beggars whose coughs were blamed on hunger, sailors found still on their pallets, monks who died too quietly to be remembered. Then the pattern revealed itself, trembling in the hands, a flush in the temples, then swelling, hard, red-black, groaning with poison, in the neck, the groin, under the arms. Pain like burning knives, fevers that boiled sanity. People cried out in languages they no longer spoke. Some clawed at their own skin, begging to be unmade. The city groaned beneath the weight of its own breath. Constantinople, the jewel of the Eastern world, began to darken. Streets, once paved with incense and sandals, now filled with silence and flies. Bakers abandoned their ovens mid-rise. Priests died mid-prayer. Mothers left cradles untouched, too sick to weep. No family was spared, and no class untouched. Senators stumbled into alleys with glassy eyes. Eunuchs collapsed on marble floors. Gold meant nothing. Rank meant nothing. Only death remained constant. They buried the dead in trenches, then in towers, then nowhere at all. When the gravediggers died, the bodies simply stayed, stacked in homes, lining the gutters, veiled in linen, or nothing at all. Some said the wind itself had grown foul. Others claimed it was the end of days, that angels of wrath walked unseen through the hippodrome. There were stories of ghosts roaming Hagia Sophia, whispering the names of those who would die next. And still, it spread. Like fire in dry brush, it leapt from city to city, Antioch, Jerusalem, Alexandria, then farther, to Syria, Persia, the Italian coasts, the Gaulish frontiers, even the cold green wilds of Britannia. In time, a third of the known world lay stricken. The plague did not discriminate. It devoured monks and merchants, children and conquerors alike. Entire villages ceased to exist. Roads grew silent, crops withered in their fields, untended. In some places, wolves walked into towns unchallenged. Even the emperor was not spared. Justinian fell ill, shivering, drenched in sweat, muttering in his sleep. Courtiers feared the end of all order, but he survived somehow, rose from his bed like a man pulled from a grave. Yet something in his eyes had changed. He continued to rule, yes, wars resumed, laws passed, churches rose, but his vision no longer soared. the divine fire in him flickered. He had touched death and found no glory there. But the empire had been wounded deeper than he knew. For 200 years, the plague came and went, like a tide drawn by no moon. It would vanish, then return, sometimes with fury, sometimes with quiet cruelty. A mother might bury her child, then live untouched for 20 winters, only to die in a second wave. Priests recorded the years, not by emperors, but by pestilence. The year of black wind, the year of weeping, the long Lent. Some believed it was a curse, a punishment for Justinian's arrogance, for waging war as if he were Jupiter incarnate. Others whispered it was the devil's breath, or a forgotten god reclaiming his due. The healers bled the sick, the magicians burned herbs. Nothing worked. The plague moved by its own laws, unseen, unreasoning, unbound. And yet, the world did not end. People mourned, then married. Fields lay fallow, then flowered again. Churches echoed once more with song. The empire limped on, smaller, wearier, thinned like old parchment. But alive. Traders still sailed, children still played. But the memory of death hung in every alley, clung to every prayer. A wound that never fully closed. Even centuries later, when the fires of plague burned through Europe again as the Black Death, the old records would be found. Brittle scrolls, letters from monks and merchants, speaking of a darkness from long ago that felt eerily the same. The disease had a name by then, Yersinia pestis. But names are only charms we speak to make sense of terror. The thing that walked ashore at Pelusium needed no name. It needed only a crack in the door. What remains of those days are fragments. A half-melted coin buried with its owner. A bishop's letter pleading for more cloth to wrap the dead. Graffiti on a wall in Alexandria. We lived, then we didn't. Somewhere beneath the palaces of modern Istanbul, under layers of time, bones still lie where they fell. Some were never claimed. Others were buried in haste, in fear, in silence. They sleep now in the dust of empire, their stories forgotten, their names unspoken. But the shadow they left stretches still, long and dark, across the soul of the world. For the Eastern Roman Empire endured, yes. But what came after was quieter, dimmer. The old certainty, the divine conviction of imperial eternity had cracked. Something in the heart of the world had changed. It was not a fall, but a dimming. A slow breath drawn in and never fully exhaled. Beneath a sky thick with monsoon shadow and the slow breath of fog, there lies a silence so deep, it seems the earth itself is holding its tongue. In that silence, stone towers rise like forgotten gods, their faces still, enigmatic, watching with the weight of centuries. Vines like serpents wind through their jaws. Fig trees erupt from the spines of palace walls. And if one listens long enough, past the calls of cicadas and the distant hiss of rain, one may hear the forest whisper, not in words, in weeping. This was Angkor, once the heart of the mighty Khmer Empire, now a monument devoured not by war, but by water, root, and fever. It was not always thus. There was a time when Angkor glittered like a crown on the brow of Southeast Asia. The temples did not yet sleep beneath canopy and mist, and the canals flowed with purpose, not rot. Carved into the very jungle, this city bloomed, a miracle of stone and water. Engineers traced sacred geometry into the earth, cutting moats and reservoirs with divine precision. Water moved like blood through veins, nourishing rice fields, feeding temples, filling lotus ponds, where queens once floated in golden boats. And towering above it all was Angkor Wat, a celestial fortress where the gods were said to walk among men. Here, every sandstone relief was a prayer, every stair led heavenward, every shadow was sacred. But water, for all its grace, is a cruel and capricious god. The monsoons began to change, not with rage, but with confusion. Rains that once fell with reliable rhythm became erratic. Floods swelled, then vanished. Droughts cracked the earth where lilies once bloomed. The engineers responded with ambition. They built more channels, higher dams, deeper moats. They cut the land like a surgeon carves flesh, hoping to outwit the heavens. And the heavens laughed. The canals clogged, water stagnated. The great barriers, once shimmering mirrors of the sky, darkened with algae and silence. Fish died, frogs thickened the air with their dirges. Then came the fever. It began in the wet places, in the shaded hollows where water lingered. Invisible things multiplied, born on the breath of mosquitoes, nested in the lungs of the faithful. First, it was the workers, then the priests, then the children. The sacred lotus ponds, meant for ritual cleansing, became mirrors for the dead. Bodies drifted between lily pads, eyes wide, mouths full of silence. The diseases had no name, only whispers. The monks spoke of a jungle spirit angered by hubris. The peasants called it the wet sickness. Some claimed it was the curse of forgotten ancestors, their bones drowned beneath the newest reservoir. Others said the gods had turned away, no longer seeing themselves reflected in the muddy waters. But whatever it was, it did not arrive in thunder. It crept. It slithered. A fever that seared the body and left the skin pale and streaked with red, like the petals of a broken flower. Another that filled the lungs with fluid until prayers became gargles. There were those who simply vanished, walked into the jungle in delirium, chasing voices only they could hear. And yet, the temples stood. The stone faces of Bayon smiled through it all, serene and unknowable, as if remembering a joke the world had forgotten. Angkor did not fall in a day. No trumpet blared, no enemy marched. The capital emptied like a bowl tipped at its edge. Markets quieted, palaces dimmed. Ritual fires guttered to ash. Some left for Phnom Penh. Others followed the river south, seeking clean water and new omens. The kings still wore their crowns, but their thrones stood on sinking mud. The jungle, ever patient, waited. Vines tightened their grip, trees split shrines, roots grew through courtyards where dancers once spun in golden skirts. The forest was not reclaiming. It was remembering. Remembering when it had no rivals. And so, stone by stone, Angkor was unmade, not by blade, not by betrayal, but by the slow erosion of certainty. When Western explorers finally stumbled upon it centuries later, they found no gods, no kings, no prayers, only temples swallowed whole, faces peeking through leaves, towers where parrots nested, walls crumbling under the weight of fig and thyme. There were tales among the locals that Angkor was not abandoned, but dreaming, that at night the monks still walked the galleries, invisible to those who did not carry incense, that the ponds, though silent, were never truly empty, and to disturb their waters was to invite the memory of the fever. Some claim to have seen lights moving through the trees at dusk, not fireflies, not torches, but orbs, pale and pulsing, like breath in mist. And always there was the weeping, soft, almost imagined, like a mother mourning in a temple long sealed. Today, tourists arrive in the light of morning when the jungle seems tamed. They walk the ancient roads with cameras. They touch the carved apsaras, their smiles worn thin by centuries of rain. Guides tell them stories, sell them postcards. But as the sun tilts west and the air grows heavy, something changes. The shadows stretch longer than they should. The trees lean closer. The birds go quiet. And though no signs are posted, locals whisper the same warning: do not stay past twilight, not just for safety, but because Angkor mourns. It remembers the fevered breaths of the dying, the prayers drowned in still water, the mistake of believing one could master the divine with stone and sluice gates. So the jungle sings its lullaby, slow, green, patient. And the stones listen, always smiling, always waiting. The rain had not fallen in Susa for 3 moons, and when it did, it was not the rain of life. It was blackened, streaking down from a sky the color of rust, as if the heavens wept the ink of mourning. Beneath that veil, in the once sacred city of the Elamites, the last oil lamps flickered in abandoned shrines. They hissed in the wind like dying serpents, shadows stretching thin over shattered mosaics and broken offerings. No songs, no chants, no war drums echoing across the ziggurat steps. Just the silence of rot and the whisper of death threading through dust. Susa, cradle of divinity and dominion, where kings once spoke to the gods on stone staircases painted with ochre suns, now lay cracked and gasping. This land had been old when Babylon was young. Here, the Elamites had carved their legacy not in conquest, but in sacred continuity. Slow, deliberate, reverent. Their temples rose not in boast, but in balance with the earth, mud brick and marble stacked in solemn symmetry, mirroring the mountains to the east. They wrote with signs curved like wind-drawn fire, etched into clay tablets that once numbered taxes, births, invocations to Inshushinak, god of the underworld, keeper of fate. But none could have foreseen what was to come. Some say it began with the soldiers. Dust-bitten and delirious, they stumbled home from the western frontier, their bronze armor clanging with fatigue, their mouths blistered and dry. They had fled the Assyrian blades, blades that knew no mercy, swords slicked with the blood of kings and commoners alike. Yet it was not steel that doomed them. It was something else, something slower, something unseen. A sickness rode their footsteps. At first, it was mistaken for the weariness of war, a fever perhaps, a weakness of spirit. But then, in the shadowed courtyards of Susa, children began to scream in the night, their limbs contorting, their joints swollen like overripe fruit. Mothers found teeth loose in their babes' mouths, not from age, but from rot. Priests anointed foreheads with ash and spoke prayers through trembling lips. Still the sickness spread. It did not discriminate. It crept beneath doorways, into granaries and armories, into schools where scribes once taught the looping language of the gods. It took the shepherd and the queen alike, laying them side by side beneath woven blankets that did little to warm corpses cooling far too fast. Some tried to flee, into the hills, into the rivers. But the sickness followed like a shadow that could not be outrun. The rivers themselves were not safe. Where water once sang, now it reeked. There were rumors that Assyrian soldiers had defiled the sacred wells, dumping carcasses into the streams, damming the flow of the divine. Whether truth or terror, no mouth that drank from them lived long. And so slowly, Elam ceased. The drums fell silent first, then the markets, then the court scribes, who once chronicled days in tablets lined with silver script. Their final entries end abruptly, as if the hands that wrote them were seized mid-prayer. No invaders came. No siege was laid upon Susa's gates. The wind blew, but the banners no longer danced. The temple stood, empty. Statues of gods stared with eyeless stone at streets choked with the dead. Only the flies came faithfully. And when the Assyrians finally marched into Elam's heart, they found no resistance. Just bones beneath scorched brick. Just sandals abandoned at thresholds, pots left to boil into ash. The capital, Susa, that had once risen like a pearl on the plains, now resembled a mausoleum with no mourners. The invaders burned what they could, but the soul of Elam had already been reduced to whispers. Yet what haunts us still are not the ruins, but the remains. In the soil around Susa's ruined temples, beneath layers of soot and collapse, they have found the graves, not lined in rows of fallen warriors, but in heaps of the too young, the too old. There is no evidence of blade or arrow, no cracked skulls, no pierced ribs, only swollen joints, teeth gone before their time, skulls bowed in supplication, or perhaps agony. What did this? What name did it bear? Perhaps none. Some deaths come silently, with no myth to carry them forward. This plague, if plague it was, did not roar. It did not leave sagas. It left only silence. And in that silence, memory rotted too. Other civilizations told stories of their ends. The Babylonians sang of floods. The Hittites etched curses into stone. But the Elamites left no lament. Only pottery shards in broken homes. Clay tablets half fired in kilns that were never reopened. Mosaics depicting gods whose names we've forgotten. Their lips sealed in eternal stillness. Some say Elam's fall was divine punishment, that in Shushinak, their underworld god, grew jealous of the living and called them all to his realm. Others whisper that the land itself rebelled, vomiting forth a sickness to rid itself of those who no longer heeded the old ways. But perhaps there is no reason. Perhaps ruin needs no architect. Perhaps Elam was simply forgotten, and in that forgetting truly perished. There is a strange kind of death that does not come with conquest or cataclysm. It is the death of erasure, of tongues unspoken, of prayers unanswered, of footsteps no longer heard on temple stones. Elam died, not just in body, but in story. Their myths did not survive the sickness. Their gods were not adopted by others. Even their enemies wrote of them only in passing, as one writes of a ghost glimpsed in a ruined doorway. Tonight, if you listen closely, not with ears, but with soul, you may hear them in the wind, in the low hum of silence between dreams. The Elamites, who built temples older than memory, who worshipped in whispers and guarded mysteries, now buried beneath sand and soot. They were not loud, they were not many, but they were, and now they are no more. Only the pale death remains, that strange, slow unraveling that needs no warhorse, no banner, no name. The kind that comes like fog, like forgetting. The kind that takes not only lives, but the very echo of them. Sleep now, and remember them, if only for a while, for memory is the only flame that still burns in Susa, beneath the burning bronze sky, where the waves of the Levant once whispered against the carved harbors of Ugarit. A silence now reigns so complete it seems the city itself has forgotten how to breathe. It was not always thus. There was music here once, etched in clay, strung like sacred incantation across tablets that sang of gods and kings and seasons. The first written hymn, they say, was born of this soil. But now, the winds that stir the dust sing only of endings. In Ugarit, the silence tells a story deeper than ruin. It is the echo of something that left no survivors to name it. At twilight, when the red sun bleeds into the sea, the ruins take on the glow of embers, as if the city is still burning in memory. Long ago, these streets teemed with sandal-footed merchants, linen-draped priests, and wide-eyed scribes. Ships from Cyprus and Egypt docked at its bustling port, their hulls fat with copper, incense, and lapis lazuli. Within its palace walls, bronze tablets clicked and clacked under the stylus of scribes who charted the whims of gods and kings alike. Grain was measured, debts were recorded, marriages arranged, and oracles sealed in the curling tongue of cuneiform. It was a city not just of trade, but of prophecy. They watched the stars from rooftops, fed their gods with blood and barley, read the livers of goats for omens. But no sign foretold what came. No tablet prepared them for the breathless dark. One final letter was found, cracked but legible. The enemy is near. We do not know how to fight them. For centuries, scholars believed that enemy had a face, helmets of horn, oars biting through the wine-dark sea. The sea peoples, they said, marauders from foreign waters, toppling empires like dice from a shaking hand. But something in Ugarit's death feels colder than war, stranger. There were no signs of siege, no clash of blade upon shield, only a stillness that settled suddenly like frost at dusk. Inside the homes, plates of food sat untouched, half-eaten figs shriveled in bowls. A loom abandoned midweave, doors left ajar as if their owners meant to return. But they never did. The city was not conquered. It was vacated. It was hushed. Beneath one house, they found bodies buried hastily, layered in confusion. No grave goods, no ceremony, just the dead, stacked like wood, some clutching children, mouths open in silent pleading. Others were found inside the palace, lying where they fell, as if struck down not by spear, but by something unseen. Among the tablets was another, less famous, less deciphered, scrawled in a trembling hand. It spoke of fever, of a heat that burned through the blood, of coughs that turned red, of dreams where the gods walked past the sick without stopping. We have sacrificed, it reads, but the sickness does not know our gods. It listens to no name. There are whispers now among modern scholars that the true destroyer was plague, carried not by armies, but by breath, infected grain offloaded from the hold of a merchant ship, rats with crimson eyes, or perhaps a dying sailor gasping for air as he staggered onto the quay, his lungs already drowning from within. The sickness spread not by sword, but by touch, by nearness, by air. The people fled, not from battle, but from each other. And the silence grew. It did not stop with Ugarit. Within decades, the lights dimmed across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenae fell, Hatti vanished. Cities in Cyprus blackened into ash. Egypt barely withstood the storm, its records trembling with references to foreign flame, to a darkness over the lands. Everywhere, the same signs, mass graves, collapsed buildings, and letters that simply stop, as if the scribes had dropped their styluses mid-word and did not return. What if Ugarit was the first to fall, or merely the first to whisper its death into clay? Imagine it now. A mother in Ugarit, waking before dawn to grind barley. She notices the child beside her is fevered, twitching in his sleep. By dusk, his breath is shallow, and by dawn he is gone. The neighbors avoid her door. Her husband never returns from the harbor. The streets grow quieter. Fires burn unattended. Somewhere, a priest chants alone to a god who no longer listens. And in the palace, a scribe, young, uncertain, presses the final message into clay, his hands trembling, the tablet still warm when he sets it aside, never to be baked. The enemy is near. We do not know how to fight them. There is a cruelty in the way Ugarit ends, not with fire or blood, but with a whisper and a question. No grand final battle, no last stand, just the slow, invisible unraveling of life. It is said that the gods of Ugarit were many: Baal, the stormbringer; El, the father of time; Anat, the warrior maiden. But even they did not save the city. Perhaps they too were afraid. When archaeologists uncovered the ruins in the 20th century, they were astonished by the richness of the records. Entire libraries of tablets, preserved in mud brick vaults, music transcribed in cuneiform, a hymn to Nickel, goddess of orchards, sweet and strange across millennia. But the music ends. Mid-verse, mid-breath. What survives are echoes. The note not played, the letter not sent, the meal not finished. Tonight, beneath the stars once charted by Ugarit's priests, the ruins lie half swallowed by Syrian soil. Wind moves through shattered walls like a ghost returning home. And somewhere, perhaps, the spirits of the forgotten city still wander, searching for answers in the dust, asking why the gods did not answer, why the music stopped, why no one came. Not every enemy arrives with a blade. Some creep in softly, without a name. And when they leave, they take more than life. They take memory. They take voice. And so Ugarit sleeps, not broken, but emptied. Its silence heavier than stone. Its end not a fall, but a fading. A city that sang the first song, and then fell into an eternal pause. The air here is thinner than memory, and older than dust. Across the high plateaus of central Mexico, where clouds drag their bellies low and the sun drips gold into the crevices of black volcanic rock, the bones of forgotten empires slumber. Their names are no longer spoken, not because they were unworthy, but because they were too sacred, too heavy for the mouths of the living. Beneath obsidian soil and the whispering stalks of wild maize, entire nations turned to ash long before the first muskets echoed through these valleys. But the land remembers. The wind still weeps in Nahuatl. The stones still bleed. There are tales that no one tells aloud, lest the earth hear and awaken. Among them is the blood mirage, the Kokolisli, the sickness that danced like firelight in the eyes of the dying. It came not with conquest, but with silence. Not with swords, but with thirst. It began in the highlands, sometime after the first crucifixes were planted into temple walls. Around the year 1545, while the conquistadors still gorged on the smoke and gold of Tenochtitlan's ruins, the air grew wrong, dry, thin. The rivers receded as though retreating from something unseen. Crops failed beneath a copper sky. And then came the fever. It had no name then, only the scream. The Kokolisli. In the old tongue, it meant pestilence, but also something deeper, darker, a shaking of the soul. It crept in like a jealous god, one that favored neither Spanish nor native, but hungered for breath and blood in equal measure. Its symptoms were more a possession than a disease. Eyes that bled, tongues that blackened, minds that dissolved into screaming. The afflicted would convulse, soil themselves, beg the sun to stop burning. Then, silence, days, sometimes hours, then death. It was not smallpox, no. That enemy had marched behind Cortes, brutal but predictable. This was something else, something that moved with the weather. Some said it was born of the earth itself, an ancient spirit awakened by conquest. Others whispered that it was a curse loosed by the gods in their grief, a final offering from Huitzilopochtli, the sun god, whose temples now lay gutted and defiled. The Spanish physicians could not name it. Their leeches and tinctures failed. Even their Catholic rites rang hollow in these hills. The native priests, their feathers burned and their temples crumbled, wept beside idols half buried in rubble. They offered bulk, obsidian knives, deer hearts, even children. But the sickness drank only blood, and it did not stop. Entire villages vanished. Smoke curled from rooftops where no fires had been lit. Dogs howled until their throats were red. In the canyons of Oaxaca and the shadowed ridges of Puebla, the living spoke in hushed tones, calling it the Red Breath, a spirit of wind and hunger. And indeed, it often came on the wind, a sudden gust, a scent of iron and herbs, and by nightfall, the first bleeding eyes. By morning, death. One Franciscan friar, Brother Martin de la Cruz, kept a journal, now lost to fire. But fragments survive in the accounts of terrified monks. He wrote of a village where the Kokolistli struck so fast that a wedding became a funeral before the altar candles had burned down. He described mothers clutching infants who bled from their ears, of altars soaked in blood, not from sacrifice, but from the prayers of the dying who had crawled there to scream. Martin believed it was divine punishment, but he could not say for whom. Even the idols have turned their backs, he wrote. There is no mercy here. And still it spread. The soil cracked open. The rains refused to come. Starvation marched hand in hand with sickness, and the people began to disappear. By the end, some say 15 million were gone. A silence deeper than conquest had fallen. Modern voices, far removed from that sacred desolation, claim science has glimpsed the plague's shadow. A hemorrhagic fever, perhaps. A native virus exacerbated by the stress of colonization, malnutrition, and drought. But even they cannot explain its cruelty, its speed, its precision. Why some valleys died and others lived. Why the gods were so quiet. In the canyons where it began, where wild maguey still curls like green tongues between rocks, there are ruins untouched by time. Not grand temples or pyramids, but stone altars left with bundles of herbs, chicken feathers and bone. The air is heavier there, sweet, coppery. Sometimes you can still smell it. That mirage of blood and smoke, like the breath of a fever dream. The Spanish feared those valleys. Even the bravest captains refused to settle them. Haunted, they said, blighted. They built missions elsewhere, farther from the wind. And those who survived, few and trembling, did not speak of it. Not to their children, not to their gods, not even to themselves. But the memory remained in their bones, in the lullabies sung in quiet tones, in the way they covered mirrors during storms, in the sudden silences that fell when someone mentioned the year 1545. And so the blood mirage faded from words, but not from the land, not from the wind. It lingers invisible and eternal, a ghost made of breath and hunger, a reminder that not all wounds are made by blade or bullet. Some are made by absence, by the breaking of the sacred order, by the silence of gods too ancient to save what they once shaped. Perhaps that is the lesson of the Kokolistli, not the death, but the forgetting. For what is worse, to die or to be erased from memory. The moon hangs pale and breathless over the ruins now. The maze has grown back. The rivers run again, timid and slow. But beneath the quiet loam, beneath the old obsidian veins, a whisper stirs. The dead do not speak, but the wind does. And in it, you may hear the final breath of a world too holy to survive the collision of steel and spirit. A world that once sang in stone and blood and thunder, and now only dreams. They called it the wind that could not be outrun. It came not with drums or hoofbeats, nor in the shimmer of distant steel, but with silence, thick and low, curling like incense over the open steppe. Horses screamed in their sleep. Dogs fled from their own shadows. And when the elders threw shoulder bones into the fire, the cracks whispered of death. Before the rise of the Khans and the golden standards of empire, before the thunderous age of Mongol banners sweeping westward, there were older peoples, the Xiongnu, the Yuezhi, the Wusun, tribes whose names now echo like the cries of smoke in a cold sky. They danced with wind and worshipped stars, carving their lives into the ever-moving horizon. Their lives beat with hooves and firelight, with shaman chants beneath the open heavens, where Tengri, the sky god, saw all and answered little. But then, in the year we now mark as 200 CE, something unseen broke free from the sacred balance. A sickness awoke beneath the grass, some say, a curse loosed from the belly of the land. Others believed it had always been there, sleeping in the blood of marmots and the bones of ancient oxen, waiting only for the drought to crack the earth wide enough to breathe. The Chronicles of the Han Empire speak of it sparingly, as if fearful the words themselves might carry infection. A plague from the grasslands, they wrote, a vapor that raced faster than mounted scouts. No border could restrain it, no oracle could read it, no rider outpaced it. It drifted like smoke from fireless hearths. And when it reached a village, it did not knock. The warriors of the Xiongnu fell before their blades left their sheds. Proud riders slumped in their saddles, coughing blood into furs dyed with sky spirits. The shamans burned wolf hair and chanted into the wind, but even their drums grew silent. It was said that the gods themselves had turned away, covering their faces with stars. Children's eyes dulled mid-play. Stallions collapsed mid-stride, as if the world's breath had stopped. Mothers braided the hair of their dying sons. Entire clans vanished like mist on the morning plain. Some say it was the pneumonic plague, breath-carrying death, passed from lip to lip in the hush of tents. Others whisper of anthrax, ancient and bone-born, disturbed by hunger's desperate digging. But there are no diagnoses in the songs of the steppe, only mourning, only memory. As the wind deepened and the herds thinned, the sacred migrations began, not of the healthy, but of the haunted. The tribes broke apart, not in war, but in whispers. The Yuezhi turned west, toward the burning deserts and strange rivers. The remnants of the Xiongnu faded north into fog and forest, and behind them the bones of children clattered in the wind. From the ashes of the scattered, new storms began to gather. The Hun confederacies, born in hunger and hardened by exile, would one day strike the Roman frontiers like thunder on dry stone. The Turks, forged from loss and tempered by silence, would one day burn empires into memory. But their first cradle was not a throne, nor a battlefield. It was a death wind, quiet, invisible, and absolute. That wind carved a silence no drum could fill. Even now, on certain nights, when the steppe lies sleepless beneath a bruised moon, you can hear it, not as a scream, but as an absence, a gap in the world's breathing, a stillness too large to be natural. The grass shifts, though there is no wind. The horses grow restless, and old men, warming their fingers near sacred fire pits, tell stories with no endings. They say the sky spirits never returned fully, that Tengri, ashamed of his silence, no longer speaks clearly to the shamans, that something sacred was broken in those years when prayers died faster than the sick. The sacred hills of the Altai still wear their burial mounds like necklaces of sorrow. Beneath them sleep warriors who never raised their spears, children who never saw a second spring, lovers wrapped in fur, their lips forever parted by fever. No chronicles can tell us what they dreamed in their final hours, when the blood ran dark and the world grew cold. But the grass remembers. It grows taller there, where bones once whispered to roots. It leans gently, always westward, as if still fleeing. In time, the memory of the death wind would become something more myth than plague, a tale to hush children or to remind chiefs of their mortality. But deep within the marrow of history, it lingers, the first tremor before the avalanche, the invisible ember that would one day ignite the steppe into fury. Because what is empire but the echo of catastrophe? What is conquest but a child born of survival? The horse lords who would later thunder across the world, Attila, Bumin, Genghis, all rode from the dust of those broken tribes. Their saddles rested on the graves of those who died breathless, their banners flapped in winds seeded by that first silent storm. But long before banners, before bloodlines and boasts, there was only the wind, a death wind, a hush so vast it could split mountains, a sickness so precise it knew the names of the unborn. Now, when the stars turn cold above the steppe, and the wind moves not from east nor west, but from beneath the grass, the elders do not speak. They pour fermented mare's milk into the dirt and lower their eyes. And the land, vast, endless, unbroken, listens, because it remembers the red began in the roots, not on the streets, nor from the mouths of men, but from deeper places, where the stones murmured to one another in silence, where the soil carried memory like blood through a body. Beneath the olives, beneath the columns, beneath the broken teeth of lions carved in marble, something ancient stirred. And when it rose, it did not roar. It bled, slowly, solemnly, as if the city itself were weeping from within. Cyrene, in the heat of her golden age, was not meant for ruin. She had been a crown jewel nestled in the rugged hem of Libya's coast, her fingers dipping into the cool salt of the Mediterranean. Built by Greeks, fed by sacred springs, and kissed by the breath of Apollo himself, or so the temple hymns claimed, she had been a haven for scholars, mystics, and healers. Her streets echoed with philosophy, her groves shimmered with wisdom. And in the hour before dusk, the fig trees cast shadows like inked verses across the mosaic floors. The springs were said to cure the sick. Pilgrims walked for weeks with blistered feet and bandaged faith to bathe in their waters. They came not just for healing, but for revelation, to dream beneath the pines, to hear the god's voice in the rush of falling water, to be made whole. But gods, when neglected, become hungry. It began in the bathhouses, where laughter echoed off marble and the steam curled like lazy serpents in the air. At first, it was a few fevers, harmless, passing. But then came the tremors, the blood, the skin, once flushed with warmth, began to blacken at the fingertips like fruit left too long in the sun. Veins burst beneath the surface, eyes turned red, then blind. And still, the spring water flowed, but now with a copper tint, faint as the breath of rust, unmistakable to those who drank it. A Roman physician, exiled to Cyrene in disgrace, left a scroll behind. It was found years later, clutched in a mummified hand, stained with time and some darker fluid. He wrote of internal ruptures, of organs that dissolved themselves. He blamed the air, the vapors from the south, as if the wind itself had betrayed them. But others whispered differently, of rites forgotten, of a priestess who refused the sacred vows, of a boy left unburied, his spirit condemned to wander the temple steps at twilight. Some claimed a shadow passed through the olive groves before the first signs. Not a man, not a beast, but a form shaped like silence itself, brushing past leaves without rustling them. A woman in white, weeping blood. A centaur with no face. Visions multiplied as fevers spread. In the vineyards, men screamed about wolves that spoke Latin. In the gymnasia, scholars scratched unreadable symbols into their own skin, muttering of the return of the black sun. The priests of Apollo sealed the main temple when their own acolytes began to die mid-ritual. Birds no longer circled the colonnades. Cats disappeared. Even the dogs would not approach the spring pools. Those who lingered too long near the waters began to dream of being underwater, unable to rise, always sinking deeper into warmth that turned thick, then cold, then crushing. It crept across the city like spilled wine. No one knew where it came from. Some blamed the goats, others the traders from Alexandria. A few held fast to the idea of divine wrath, that the god was angry for reasons beyond mortal grasp. Perhaps too many foreign idols had crept into the shrines. Perhaps the sacred grove had been cut for firewood. Perhaps, and this was whispered with trembling lips, the god had simply grown bored with them. And so the baths emptied, the temples closed, the markets fell silent. Doors were marked with soot, children were hidden. The air grew thick with the scent of myrrh and decay. Funeral chants drifted like smoke down alleyways. When Roman aid finally arrived, weeks too late and weighed down with bureaucratic confusion, they found a city half in shadow. Not aflame, not screaming, but hushed. The kind of silence that belongs in tombs. Statues lay in the dirt beside the dead, scrolls, half burnt or soaked in blood, unraveled in the gutters, pomegranates rotted untouched in the stalls. In the house of a once renowned healer, now empty, a single silver cup remained, filled to the rim with red water, untouched, unevaporated. Some say the Romans fled the same day. Others say they tried to clean the streets, to bury the bodies, to preserve what wisdom could be salvaged. But the truth is veiled, as if the city herself did not wish to be remembered fully. The reports dwindle into fragments. Names fade. Maps contradict one another. No great account remains. Cyrene was rebuilt, eventually, but never again did she shine as she had. The philosophers returned, though fewer in number. The priests reopened the temples. though the main pool was never cleansed. A new statue of Apollo was raised, taller, whiter, more austere, but the birds never nested on its head. The fig trees bore fruit, but it tasted bitter for a generation. And the waters, no one drank from them anymore. Travelers who pass through the ruins today speak of a strangeness, a sweetness in the air that shouldn't be there, like oleander blooming out of season, wind that moves without source, cats that watch from broken thresholds, unmoving, and always, always, the sense of being observed, not malevolently, just remembered, as though something deep within the stone remembers that summer, remembers the laughter, and the bleeding, and the god who turned his face away. They say the wind does not blow in Cajon anymore, only sighs, not the kind made by breeze or bird, but the kind that memory makes when left too long in the dark. Somewhere beyond the brow of time, where the Nile once wound like a blue artery through stone and reed, there was a place where life clung to the edges of a pharaoh's command. Not a city, not quite, but a vessel of human toil carved into the desert's skin. A worker's town, Cajon, built in the breath of a king's whim and hollowed in the silence of something far older than any dynasty. There, where the pyramids rise like petrified hymns, the town of Cajon slept beneath sand for millennia. A temporary thing, forgotten not with ceremony, but with dust. And yet, it once thrummed with breath and sweat and heat, stonecutters and bakers and scribes, women with children swaddled in linen, priests with ink-stained hands, and prayers dried in their mouths. The walls were straight and tight, the houses pressed together like clustered ribs. It had order, it had rhythm. Until one night, it had neither. No scroll speaks of its end, no lamentation, no statue broken in rage. Cajon vanished like a gasp swallowed mid-sentence. And still, something remains. It was first uncovered in the late 19th century when Sir Flinders Petrie's spade struck something stranger than stone. Not gold, not a tomb, but rooms, rows of them, everyday life fossilized in place. An oil lamp knocked over beside a still full grain basket, a spindle mid-spin, a loaf of bread turning to charcoal in a clay oven. As if the town had been called away in the midst of living. More than the treasures of kings, this was something holier. The silence of the ordinary interrupted. One could almost hear the echo of sandals slapping mud brick floors, the murmur of water jars filled at dawn, the crackling songs of workers lifting stone blocks toward the heavens. But that murmur twisted into coughing. That song gave way to silence. In the cramped homes, they found medical papyri, delicate sheets of ancient ink whispering of pain, symptoms, prescriptions, invocations, but also terror, sudden sickness, fevers that racked the bones, blood in the stool, swelling of limbs, children's eyes gone glassy in the dark. And alongside these scripts, they found mass burials, limbs bent strangely, hastily wrapped. No hieroglyphs etched into the shrouds, no prayers, just linen soaked in something heavier than sweat. One theory speaks of schistosomiasis, a curse born not by gods, but by snails. The sacred Nile, giver of wheat and fish and flax, had become a needle laced with blood-borne poison. Parasites that swam in the canals, invisible, clinging to skin and seeping through. They coiled in intestines and bladder and brain. They robbed the strong of breath, the children first, then their mothers, then the men who could lift stone no more. Another whisper tells of cholera. or anthrax, hiding in irrigation, buried in livestock. Sickness not of wrath, but of water. Water meant to nurture had turned apostate. In those final nights, one can almost imagine the air thick with incense and desperation, priests with trembling hands muttering spells beside the dying, midwives pressing damp cloths to burning skin, scribes too frightened to record. Even the healers abandoned their jars of herbs and incantations. Nothing could stay what had already crept into the veins of the town. And so they fled. But not like people flee a war, no clang of swords or siege. It was quieter, stranger. They left everything, households as if paused mid-breath, beds unmade, doorways open. One might picture a mother running with her infant, past her own loom still threaded with linen, a builder stumbling out, leaving his chisel still wedged in stone, a scribe's inkpot tipped, the last stroke of his pen trailing off like a dying thought. And then, nothing. The desert crept in slowly. Walls crumbled, dust filled mouths that no longer screamed. The town sank into the belly of the earth like a dream forgotten before waking. No tale was carried forward. No one claimed its dead. The pharaoh's pyramid remained, but Cahun, his people's home, was unspoken, as if it had never deserved to be remembered. Yet what is erased is sometimes louder than what is carved in stone. To walk now through the unearthed alleys is to feel watched, not by gods or jackals, but by the absence of names, by the haunting incompleteness of their farewell. Every doorway is a question, every shard of pottery a heartbeat halted. Why did they not stay to bury their kin? Why did no morning song ring across the dunes? Perhaps they believed the sickness to be divine, a curse for pride, for hubris. Or worse, perhaps they felt it was punishment for obedience, that their work in building the pharaoh's tomb had angered some deeper spirit. The desert has long memories. It carries its vengeance not in thunder, but in thirst. Some say you can still hear them in the heatless winds that sweep across the excavation. Not voices, but that same sigh, the one that seems to come from beneath the sand, from beneath the years. A breath held for too long, a breath that never truly ended. And maybe that's all that remains of Cahun, a breath waiting to be finished. So sleep now, listener, and close your eyes as if laying them in the dust of that vanished town. Let the quiet settle like linen over your chest. Hear the faint rattle of tools abandoned in the night. Smell the oven smoke that still clings to the stones. And know that somewhere beneath the pyramid's shadow, a town once lived and died and disappeared, not into myth, but into something older, something nameless. And in the dark places of the earth, perhaps that is the truest immortality of all. The heat shimmered like a ghost across the horizon, and in the heart of the Egyptian sands, the city of Akhetaten stirred beneath the weight of divine sunlight. It was said the god himself had touched this place, not with thunder or shadow, but with the quiet blaze of his eternal eye. Aten, the solar disk, had risen to claim Egypt's soul, and Akhenaten, the heretic pharaoh, was its high priest and king. In the hush of dawn, Amarna gleamed like an altar. Columns bloomed like lotus stalks from limestone courtyards. Frescoes danced with golden limbs, and sun rays shaped like hands, reaching lovingly to the lips of mortals. All other gods were banished: Osiris, Anubis, Thoth. Their names scraped from stone, their temples left to dust. Here, only the sun reigned. It fed the crops, kissed the children, watched over the sleeping and the dead, or so they prayed. But the light cannot warm bones gone cold. The city had come to life swiftly, raised in haste by decree of Akhenaten, carved from the desolate cliffs and flanked by Nile-fed marshes. A utopia of radiant symmetry, and yet, beneath its brilliance, something festered. The bones do not lie. When the archaeologists came, their brushes trembling like whispers against the stones, they found what the scribes did not write. Bodies, too many and too young. Girls with twisted spines, boys with hollowed faces, mothers curled around, still infants in eternal embraces. Limbs contorted, skulls bearing lesions, as if gnawed from within. And there was no order to the graves, no sacred geometry, no elaborate ritual. They were laid hurriedly, in silence, in sand. The paintings on the walls were left half-colored, tombs yawning, unfinished. Some say it was rebellion, that the priests of Amun, humiliated and exiled, conspired in shadows and struck back with famine and flame. Others see in the bones something more elemental, a sickness, a fever, one that moved faster than hieroglyphs could describe. Malaria, perhaps, the kind bred in the reedy waters of the nearby marshes, thick with dragonflies and decay. Or perhaps something older, something unnamed. Still, Akhenaten walked among the columns, his face cast in firelight, his strange form a mystery even to his people. They whispered behind their linen veils. He was a god made flesh, or a man marked by the heavens. His skull was long, unnaturally so, as if stretched toward the sun itself. His chest narrow, his limbs slender and delicate as reeds. Some believe it was art, a divine exaggeration meant to break from tradition. But others see in his figure the echo of disease, Marfan's, Froelic's, or something lost to the millennia. Was the pharaoh's divine image merely the reflection of affliction? Nefertiti, the beauty of 1,000 hymns, stood beside him, her own visage stern and radiant, carved on boundary stelae like a goddess. But even her image would vanish when the sands turned. Her name, too, faded from the scrolls. Their daughters, their court, their dreams, all vanished into dust, like pollen on the wind. And then came Tutankhaten, the child king born of this luminous revolution, but crowned in its ruin. His first act was to renounce the sun. He restored the old gods, changed his name to Tutankhamun, and returned to the temples of Karnak and Luxor. He sealed Amarna, brick by brick, its altars buried, its sanctuaries erased. The city did not burn. It did not fall in battle. It was forgotten. Yet the wind still sighs through its colonnades. It moves like a priest's chant between broken walls. There is something sacred in its silence. Not holiness, but the silence of things never finished. Murals frozen mid-brushstroke, hymns half-sung, lives ended mid-breath. Some nights, when the desert breathes cool and silver beneath a crescent moon, the stones hum with a memory, a girl's laughter, a footfall in the dust, the faint rustle of linen in the wind. And above it all, the great Aten still lingers, not as a god, but as a question. A perfect circle gazing down upon the ruins it once blessed. Was Amarna a dream too bright for the world? Or was it a warning written in sunbeams and shadow? In the end, it is the bones that remain, not the hymns, not the pillars, not even the names, only the shapes of suffering, the outlines of something that once burned too brightly and died too soon. The smoke over Amarna does not rise. It drifts, thin and invisible. like breath, like memory, like a ghost, waiting for the sun to return. They say the air in Babylon once shimmered like a mirage, not from heat, but from glory. Beneath the colossal gate of Ishtar, through walls glazed in lapis blue and gold lion friezes, passed merchants and messengers, soldiers and sages, offerings and oracles. It was a city not merely of bricks and bazaars, but of destiny. A city that dreamed in ziggurats and whispered to the heavens through hanging gardens. And yet, even in such divinely anointed stone, rot can find a root. The gate of the gods would one day creak open, not to kings, but to silence. There was a season, indistinct in the records, like a smear of blood on clay, when Babylon began to hush, not in ceremony, not in awe, but in dread. The skies had not yet dimmed, the Euphrates still wound through the plains, and the temples beat with incense and chant. But somewhere, in the alleys behind the outer quarters, someone began to sweat, not from the sun, but from something deeper, something blooming like black flowers beneath the skin. They called it Enam Lugal Ikshud, the sickness that conquers kings. But no name could cage it. It moved faster than prayer, faster than punishment, invisible and insatiable. Fever came first, then the dreams, twisting visions of serpents coiled in the rafters, gods with bleeding eyes, familiar faces melting like wax. Then the pustules, a map of pain erupting across bodies, yellow and weeping. The afflicted were dragged to the temples, where the high priests poured sulfur over their limbs and anointed their heads with cedar oil. Lambs were slaughtered and buried in walls. Salt was burned. Prayers were howled. But still the sickness danced. Clay tablets, brittle and half erased by time, mention walls sealed with fire, districts abandoned to the wind, and a silence that took the mouths of children. Some have tried to decipher the diagnosis. Was it smallpox? A spectral strain of measles? Or something forgotten? Something that brushed only Babylon and vanished with its breath? It matters little. The fear was real. The scribes, once so faithful in their daily recordings of trade, law, and rainfall, began to falter. Their marks grew rushed, crooked, then blank. Archives break mid-sentence. A census tablet from year 43 of Nebuchadnezzar II notes a drastic drop in births and a curious surplus of grain. Not due to blessing, but to the absence of hands to eat. In the temple of Marduk, the grand rituals fell from pageantry to plea. Processions grew smaller, offerings rotted on altars. The sacred flutes played for ghosts. And still, the gardens grew. The hanging gardens, whether they truly hung or only in the hearts of poets, remained untouched by flame or invader. Vines coiled like sleeping serpents around marble columns. Fig trees cast shadows on crumbling courtyards. What once was manicured and worshipped began to sprawl. Nature, indifferent to empires, softened the edges of Babylon's geometry. Petals fell where scrolls once lay. Some spoke of a curse, a punishment for the king's pride, or for the impiety of the merchants who built idols of silver, while the poor starved outside the gate of Shamash. Others whispered that the gods themselves had turned their faces away, unable to endure the wailing any longer. Quarantine became law, then instinct. Brick barriers rose within the city, dividing street from street, family from family. Smoke seeped from chimneys where sulfur burned without pause. Those who tried to flee were said to be turned back with spears, their bodies found days later beneath date palms. blistered and silent. And then came the stillness. It was not a thunderous fall. Babylon did not collapse in a single scream, as Troy once did. There were no flames licking the towers, no trumpets from enemy walls. Only this, a city vast and glorious, filled with gold and song, growing quiet. Windows shuttered, doors unlatched but never reopened. The temples echoing only with the footfall of rats, grain rotting in sealed jars, priests starving in their robes, clinging to forgotten chants. When the Persians came, they came not to conquest, but to confirmation. The gates swung open without resistance. There was no battle cry, no last stand. Only weary men with sallow faces who begged for medicine more than mercy. The conquerors walked streets lined with bones swept to the side like market refuse. They passed palaces still adorned in alabaster, their fountains dry. They found the gardens wild and humming with bees. They entered the throne room and found no king, only a crown placed carefully atop a folded robe. Babylon had already yielded, not to Cyrus, but to the invisible hand of decay. And so the gate of the gods, that shimmering fulcrum of the world, passed from the living to the legend. The tablets do not say what became of the last scribe, whether he sealed his archive with clay or with prayer, whether he too saw the pustules rise on his wrists as he carved his final line, whether he wept. What they do say, what survives even now in fractured glyphs and shattered bricks, is that the city fell from within, not from sword, but from silence, not from siege, but from breath. And the breath failed. The story of Babylon's fall is not one of war. It is the story of how even the mighty, the blessed, the celestial, can be undone by a whisper in the blood. Of how a city built for the gods still bore the lungs and fears of men. Of how vines remember, even when voices forget. Tonight, as you close your eyes and slip into dream, imagine the empty avenues of that ancient world, the soundless footsteps, the fading incense, the stone lions on the gate, watching over nothing. Imagine the last candle flickering in a shrine to Ishtar, wax pooling like tears on the floor. Somewhere, perhaps, that candle still burns, in memory, in myth, in the eternal hush that follows glory. Babylon remains, not in breath, but in echo. The wells did not whisper. They did not weep. They only watched. Carved into the sunburnt bones of the Argolid hills, they waited, round silent mouths, yawning beneath the weight of stone fortresses and glittering treasure rooms. The lords of Mycenae had once ruled the Aegean like lions in a land of lambs, their citadels perched upon ancient rock, crowned in gold, surrounded by war-hardened walls, and echoing with the music of conquest. Yet in the final twilight of their reign, when torches flickered dim against the stone and silence pressed in like a tide, the wells only deepened. At first, no one suspected them. How could they? Water was life, clear and cool, drawn by the hands of servants and soldiers alike, hauled up in clay pots and blessed at shrines. In the heat, it shimmered like salvation. But salvation turned to sickness. What poured from the depths began to taste different, thicker, sharp with the sour tang of rot. Then came the fevers. They spread like the kiss of the underworld, slow at first, then unrelenting. Pale faces glistened with sweat as children convulsed in sleep. Mothers whispered prayers to forgotten gods, wiping brows with linen already soiled by blood. And still, the water was drawn. Still, it was drunk. The wells, it seemed, had turned cruel. By then, the wind had changed. It no longer whistled through the lion gate like a herald of trade ships or returning warriors. It came heavy with the stench of something ancient, of old meat, old ruin. The bees fled the olive groves. The birds abandoned their nesting places in the rafters. Even the dogs, once fat and lazy beneath the sun, turned feral and afraid. The records, what few etched fragments remain, do not speak clearly of what followed. They murmur of siege, perhaps by Dorian hands, or vengeful enemies from beyond the isles. They speak of Troy's ashes still smouldering on the wind, of kings returned to find their palaces hollowed by absence. But the truth lies beneath, in the stone cisterns chiseled deep into the bones of Mycenae, beneath the floors of megarons, and behind sealed tomb doors. In those forgotten chambers, archaeologists would one day uncover the betrayal. Animal bones tangled with human waste, strange green stains on walls where no moss should grow, bacterial echoes locked in sediment. A sickness born not from gods, nor from arrows, but from thirst. And what a thirst it was! During siege, the wells were the veins of survival. The enemy could scale walls or batter gates, but if water remained, so too did hope. And yet, in Mycenae, it seems the veins turned black first. When the gates fell, or when they opened without resistance, the victors found not warriors with blades drawn, but bodies already stilled, limbs stiffened in fever's final prayer. Mass graves appeared hastily outside the once sacred grounds. Not the careful stone tombs lined with golden death masks and amber beads, but raw pits torn open and quickly filled. In those graves, children outnumbered elders. Their bones lay small and brittle beneath the earth, as if the city had lost its future before its past had time to surrender. Some still clutched toys, carved birds, spindles of ivory. Others wore bracelets, too large for their wrists, slipped on in haste, not honor. And then there were the tombs. Mycenaean tradition demanded reverence in death, honeyed wine, weapons, fine robes stitched with lion threads. But in those final days, something changed. The grave goods became fewer, humbler, bronze where gold once glittered, pottery hastily fired. Some tombs were sealed with half-cut slabs, as though the stonecutters had been interrupted mid-prayer. In one shaft, a mask lay askew on a skull, not fitted lovingly, but tossed like a curtain drawn against a storm. The lords themselves seemed to vanish. Some died, surely, struck by the same wasting plague that trained the children. But others left, abandoned the throne rooms, the hearth altars, the echoing halls of command. They left behind rings engraved with bull and labyrinth, left behind tablets half written in linear B, their clay hardened not by kilns, but by fire, accidental or divine. Palaces were not sacked in glorious crescendo, but consumed in sections, as if by an invisible hand. And so, Mycenae emptied. Not all at once, not with the roar of invasion or the thunder of divine judgment, but like a candle dying in still air, softly, in slow flickers, until the wax no longer remembered the flame. The lions atop the gate watched the last processions with blank eyes. Warriors with bowed heads, widows clutching urns, children too light to stir the dust with their feet. The wells remained. Even now, when the sun breaks across the Peloponnesian hills, the stones of Mycenae stand tall and tired. The gate is still guarded by lions whose eyes see only the sky, but beneath, the wells are there, sealed now, studied, silent. Sometimes in sleep, One might imagine a sound rising from those ancient throats. Water, perhaps, stirred by memories of the dead. Or something else. The breath of fever. The drip of a forgotten sacrifice. The echo of 1,000 prayers unanswered. The thirst that ended Mycenae was not only of the body, it was a hunger for permanence, for immortality through gold and conquest, for dominion over time itself. But what empire can survive when the veins go foul? What memory can endure when the storytellers are buried in unmarked graves? The wells of Mycenae did not whisper. They do not speak still. But in their silence, there is an accusation. In their depth, a warning. Drink deeply, they seem to say, but know what you swallow. They said the fever came first to the docks, whispers before winds, shadows before storms. In the ink-dark harbor of Carthage, where cedar-sailed ships once kissed the marble wharves like votive offerings to empire, the air began to rot, not from fish or tar, nor even from the burning pitch of broken hulls. It was sweeter than that, more insidious, a honey-thick scent of spoiled fruit and withering breath. Something unclean drifted in with the tide. It was the spring of the 23rd year of the First Punic War. Carthage, the mistress of the Western Sea, stood unbroken beneath a sky blood-bruised from conflict. Rome clawed ever closer, sending fleets and fire and ambition. But it was not Roman steel that struck first. It was something else, something older. The merchant vessel Astatia returned from Sardinia with no song from the crew. The sails flapped loose. No one hailed the harbor master. When the harbor guards boarded her, they found every man curled in shadow, flies painting their eyes, skin already gray with death's ink. No signs of violence, no cries for help, just silence. And that silence began to spread. The quarter of Kothon, thick with warehouse tenements and the laughter of coin counters, grew still. The air choked with the scent of smoke. Funeral pyres burning night and day as the healers refused to touch the bodies. The temple of Eshmun, god of healing, overflowed with prayers that clung to stone walls like damp incense. The priests whispered of angered deities, of offerings forgotten and altars left cold. Women pulled their veils tighter. Men stopped drinking from the city's wells. Still, the fever spread. It started in the gut, they said. Then the eyes turned red, the tongue swelled, and by the third day, madness. By the fourth, the body burned with such intensity that even cold water boiled against the skin. And then the soul, seemingly too weary to fight, left without a sound. In the upper city, where the villas of magistrates gazed down like watchful gods upon the lower quarters, the nobles tried to turn their faces from the stench. They ordered more fires, paid more coin to the temple. But death is no respecter of walls. Even the children of the elders began to cough, first in corners, then in beds, then not at all. Rumors spun like wind across the city. The Romans had poisoned the wells, some cried, cowardice in amphorae, treachery without spear. Others spoke of curses from the Isle of Melita, where ancient stones bore the names of forgotten gods. Still others remembered the long voyages, the island stops, the wild goats slaughtered in the dark without right or caution. Had they offended a sea spirit? Had the wind itself become a jealous thing? Carthage, once a chorus of trade and philosophy, became a city of whispers. Its markets grew empty, its baths cold. Even the great child sacrifices to Baal Hammon, whose fires once licked the sky with crimson hunger, were kindled more frequently, as though blood might bribe the fever into stillness. Yet nothing changed. The illness crept like a serpent, curling through alleys, behind doorways, under the heavy tapestries of those who still dared feast. It crossed thresholds, not with sound, but with silence. Always silence. And then, just as sudden as it had begun, the fever stilled. Some said it was the return of favor, that the gods, at last appeased, withdrew their wrath. Others claimed it was the cleansing winds of the Sirocco, or perhaps the blessings of new herbs brought from Alexandria, bitter roots soaked in wine and hope. But when the smoke cleared and the final pyres were extinguished, Carthage found itself changed. There were too many rooms without breath, too many beds without weight, too many doors that never opened again. The census takers wept, the cemeteries overflowed, entire districts were abandoned, their walls scratched with hasty prayers and farewell sigils. Graffiti, desperate and trembling, carved into stone. We were faithful. We watched the skies. Remember us. And there were the children. The mass graves outside the city, uncovered centuries later beneath the Tunisian sun, tell the truth with terrible clarity. Small bones, still curled in sleep. No marks of battle, no armor, just linen wrappings, lovingly folded. Dozens, hundreds, entire families interred in silence. Some modern voices will speak of typhus, of lice and crowded tenements. Others will point to sickened rats on trade ships, to unseen pests nesting in the grain silos. But Carthage knew only that death had come from the sea, like so many of their enemies. Yet this invader did not sail under a flag. It did not speak Latin. It left no ruins. Only memory. And memory in Carthage was sacred. Songs were composed, laments etched into mosaic tiles. A mythos emerged of the fever queen who wandered through the city veiled in mist, her touch both fevered and final. Children would be warned not to stay out past dusk, lest the queen catch them and cradle them into fire. Even as Carthage rose again, mighty, defiant, perfumed in trade and dripping with silver, there lingered something beneath its sandals, an ache, a breathless pause in festival laughter, a hush in the middle of prayer. And when, a century later, the Romans returned not with ships, but with salt, intent not merely on conquest, but on erasure, they found a city not surprised, but weary. The great libraries already thinned, the temples echoing, the harbor quiet. Perhaps they had already salted themselves, these Carthaginians, long ago, when the fever came. Perhaps the fever queen had returned once more to finish what she started. And now, in the ruins beneath modern Tunis, archaeologists walk softly. Their hands brush over stone steps and buried amphorae. They find child-sized urns with no markers, doorways that led nowhere, bones arranged as though still waiting for someone to come home. They dig in silence, and silence in Carthage remembers. It began not with fire, but with breath. A cough in the night, muffled beneath woolen blankets in a soldier's tent far east of the Tigris. A heat behind the eyes, dismissed as dust and sun. A line of sweat that traced the spine like an omen, from the red plains of Parthia, through the boots of the weary legionnaires. Rome inhaled a curse, not of steel or revolt, but of unseen affliction. And as the great eagle banners fluttered home in glory, they brought not triumph, but torment. The fire that would consume the empire was not kindled in wood or oil, but in blood and breath and bone. It was the 165th year of the Christian calendar. Rome, mighty and armored in marble and bronze, ruled from the mist-drenched moors of Britannia to the scorched edges of Arabia. And atop its gilded heights sat Marcus Aurelius, philosopher, soldier, emperor, a man who whispered his doubts into leather-bound meditations, even as he wielded a blade with fatal precision. He led with dignity, quiet strength, and the kind of sorrowful gaze known only to those who truly grasp power's weight. But no philosophy could guard against what slithered unseen into the heart of the empire. It began in the markets, in whispers between traders who feared gods but not germs. Then in the baths, where steam curled like incense and disease drifted freely between bores and prayers. The symptoms arrived like a curse spoken in haste, fevers that burned brighter than any hearth, throats that closed like a noose, skin blooming with scabs the color of spoiled wine, blood blackened, eyes filmed, and within days, breath vanished into silence. They called it pestilencia, a poison in the air, a punishment from the gods. The plague had no name then, only legend. The Antonine Plague, they would call it later, after the dynasty it shadowed. But for those who lived and wept through it, it needed no title. Only the memory of candles burning in rows, too long to count, the soft moan of the dying wrapped in linens, and the bitter smell of rot where incense once lingered. Galen, the physician priest of Rome, stood helpless among the afflicted. He wrote of pustules that burst like fruit beneath the sun, of men who bled from the eyes, women who burned from within. He had no cure, only scrolls and herbs and prayers. He returned from the Eastern Front just in time to see the greatest city on earth crack beneath the weight of 1,000 corpses a day. Temples became morgues. Statues of Apollo, serene and smiling, watched over pyres that devoured the flesh of senators and slaves alike. The steps of Jupiter's shrine slicked with the blood of offerings. Not animals now, but desperate humans seeking divine mercy. But the gods did not answer. The birds flew strangely, the augurs grew silent, sacrifices turned to rot on the altars, and still the fever came. The Tiber choked on ash and refuse. Children disappeared in the arms of strangers, orphaned before they could speak their own names. Streets once paved with triumphal arches now echoed with the rattle of plague carts and the hollow prayers of the dying. Entire towns vanished, not in fire, not in war, but in silence. A breath, and then no breath. Half of some cities perished. Others locked their gates and turned to madness. Marcus Aurelius remained, stoic, pale, sleepless. He walked among the tents of the sick during his military campaigns, cloaked not in silk, but in the dust of the suffering. They say he wept in private, that his eyes, once fierce with command, grew distant, as if seeing something just beyond this world. He kept writing, even as death circled closer. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think. His words, once guiding lights for virtue, now read like the last will of a world crumbling inward. Perhaps he died from it. The records are unclear, hazy with fear and smoke. In 180 CE, 15 years after the first cough in Parthia, Marcus Aurelius breathed his last. Some say it was not the plague that took him, but grief, a soul cracked by too much loss. Rome did not weep, it simply sighed, a long, tired exhale like wind escaping a broken dome. What lingered was not just death, it was doubt. For the first time in living memory, the eternal city looked inward and saw rot beneath the marble. Its gods had not answered, its philosopher king had perished, its legions though still feared, returned home not with treasures, but with ruin stitched into their lungs. The plague did not burn the city, not as Nero's fire once had, but it left deeper scars, invisible ones, spiritual ones. Smallpox, they now say, a modern name for an ancient horror. But names cannot hold the weight of 5 million dead, of pyres burning through the night, of midwives burying their own children, of priests who stopped speaking because they feared their own breath. Whatever it was, it moved like a judgment, a cleansing, or perhaps a reminder. Rome recovered in marble and column and road. The empire limped onward, bruised but still breathing. But something had shifted. A trembling had begun, a loss of certainty, the kind of slow unraveling not charted in maps, but in faith, in dreams, in the quietest corners of the soul. They called it a fire, though there were no flames. A fire that lived in the blood, in the lungs, in the hush of empty forums, and the echo of funeral bells. And when the sun rose each morning over the 7 hills, it seemed just a little dimmer, as though even Apollo himself turned his face away. The wind howled like a memory across the battlements, its breath dry with dust and centuries. Far to the west, the last embers of twilight bled into the desert horizon, and the great wall, serpent of stone and silence, clung to the earth like a scar carved by gods. But no blade had drawn this wound. No enemy had climbed its towers, nor breached its gates. And yet something darker passed through the stones, something the sentries could not see. An enemy without steel, without banners. It came not in the gallop of hooves, but in the hush between heartbeats. The year was 151 of the Common Era, and the Han dynasty, golden and radiant, began to shiver beneath the shadow of breath and fever. In the imperial capital of Luoyang, the court still danced in silk and sandalwood, incense rising like prayers into the painted rafters. Bronze mirrors reflected powdered faces, and high officials whispered beneath painted scrolls. And yet, in the hush behind closed corridors, something ancient stirred. A courtier collapsed mid-ritual, blood seeping from lips that still mouthed memorized verses. A concubine wept in her fever, clawing at visions only she could see. Physicians murmured of corrupted ki, of yin unbalanced, and fire raging in the lungs. The emperor's astrologers cast bronze coins and studied the scars of comets across the sky, divining omens from the stars that only deepened their fear. No charm soothed the dying, no elixir slowed the rot. At first, they thought it a curse confined to the court, but then the wind carried word of merchants coughing blood at caravanserais. A camel collapsed outside Dunhuang, its rider delirious and laughing at nothing. From oasis to outpost, along the Silk Road's 1,000 arteries, the sickness bloomed. It moved faster than the runners who carried imperial decrees. It moved with cinnamon bark, with rolled bolts of Persian cloth, with lapis carved into prayer beads. The great lifeline of East and West, source of wealth and wonder, had become the plague's spine. No empire was an island. As Rome simmered in its own cauldron of death, the Antonine plague choking its legions and emperors, some now whisper that a tendril of that same doom slithered eastward, stowed in cargo and breath. Others speak of a separate scourge, born in the river-swollen gutters of famine-struck cities. It did not matter. Names did not tame it. The wall had been built to halt the north wind, to guard against tribes on horseback, but it had never dreamed of facing an army so silent. Villages turned to ash without flame. Mothers watched their children die mid-song. In the province of Liang, Soldiers refused to bury their dead, fearing the breath of corpses might curse them too. Whole units vanished. Markets fell silent. Even the scrolls that recorded the annals of dynasties grew reluctant, their script brittle with uncertainty. And in the silence that followed each death, the empire itself seemed to forget its own name. Then came the mutterings of rebellion. The fields, long neglected as conscripts were called to die in distant provinces, grew wild with weeds. Rice rotted in granaries, guarded by men too weak to stand. Tax collectors were driven off by starving mobs. And in the countryside, beneath banners dyed the yellow of damp prayer cloths, the whisper of the yellow turbans rose like dust after drought. Their leader, Zhang Jue, called himself the great teacher, claiming he alone could cure the sickness of the world, not only of body, but of spirit. To his followers, the plague was not a punishment, but a sign. The heavens had turned their face from the Han. The mandate of heaven had slipped. By 184 CE, the rebellion would erupt into full flame. But the tinder had long been drying, year by year, under the fevered breath of pestilence. Those who survived did so as if haunted, their eyes dull, their dreams plagued by echoes of hacking coughs and cries in the night. And the dynasty, once the pride of 100 million souls, found itself gasping, not from war, not from invasion, but from the silent rot that spread from within. The doctors gave up recording symptoms. The records ceased to describe treatments. The language turns abstract, hesitant. It is as though history itself could not bear to look at what had come. Only in the creases of stone tablets, in the margins of forgotten almanacs, does the horror linger, like a cough in a quiet room. Outside the capital, the wall still stood, miles of grey dragonback stitched across the mountains. But the men who once lit its signal fires were long gone. The wind moved through empty towers, past collapsed barracks and rusted gongs. The wind remembers what we forget. It remembers the cries of the dying, the silence of cities, the prayers that turn to ash. And yet, the story did not end. Not entirely. For even as the Han staggered toward collapse, some scribes kept writing. Some farmers returned to their fields. Children were born in shadow, beneath the lingering breath of plague, and lived. Silk caravans would return in later years, cautious but persistent. The wall, battered and cold, would outlast even the dynasty that built it. But there was a shift. Something had broken, not only in the bodies of the sick, but in the soul of the empire. No longer could man believe he commanded the rhythms of heaven, that fortune was assured by mandate and ritual. The plague had crossed the wall, and with it, a truth more terrible than any sword, that the most ancient defenses, the most sacred dynasties, are porous when breath turns deadly. So sleep now, listener. Let the wind pass gently through your window and the candle flicker low. The wall still stands in stone, but listen closely. The wind knows. It sings not of conquest or glory, but of fevered dreams and broken dynasties, of empires unmade by what they could not see. It began with a silence too perfect to be real. Not the hush of reverence, nor the soft lull of wind carving its way through the canyons, but a silence like absence itself. As if the land had been drained of sound, and even the memory of voices was gone. The sun still painted the cliffs of Petra in gold and rose, and shadows still danced across the colonnades. But something was missing. Not just people, not just trade, but the pulse of the place, the thrum of breath and footfall that made stone sacred. And beneath that silence, something slept. Or perhaps waited. Petra, jewel of the Nabateans, carved not built, summoned from sandstone like a desert mirage made permanent, had once been a city of impossible defiance. Here, where water should never flow, it had sung in channels beneath the earth, in clay pipes woven like veins through bedrock, in hidden cisterns that fattened fig and almond. The desert was not conquered. It was courted gently and with reverence until it yielded green. Merchants came with gold and silk, spices and salt. Pilgrims with blistered feet bathed in the shade of towering facades, where gods both old and new were carved to watch in stony quiet. Children played between camel carts, priests anointed the sick, lovers whispered in arches of moonlit pink stone. Then, one year, the laughter thinned. No war came to Petra, no army razed its temples, no fire turned its beauty to ruin. Its fall was of a different order, slower, older, crueler. It began with a dry cough in the market. A boy selling pomegranates collapsed in the heat, his lips cracked, his breath like smoke. Within days, his sister followed. Then 2 children from the Acropolis. Then a mason from the southern quarter, found dead beside his chisels, his eyes clouded white. The people whispered of drought, of bad omens, but the aqueducts still flowed, or seemed to. The springs had not dried. The sky offered rain in its season. No sign had announced a curse, and yet the fever spread like fire beneath sand. A letter survives, brittle as moth wings, penned by a bishop named Ionas, sometime in the late 4th century. Addressed to no one and everyone, it reads, "They come to me with tongues blackened and eyes blind to daylight. The fever burns, not with heat but with thirst, with the absence of moisture, as if their blood turns to ash. The children die first, then their mothers, then their fathers go mad, walking into the cliffs with mouths open as if to drink the stone." No cure answered, no saint intervened. Some say it was typhoid, bred in still water, hidden beneath the once glorious city. The same aqueducts that had birthed life now turned treacherous, untended, stagnating, their secrets curdling in the dark. Others name leprosy, brought by traders from Alexandria or Antioch, slipped in with prayer beads and anointing oils. But there are older stories too, of a sickness that predates Rome or Christ, a desert curse, a breath of the gods angered by too much cleverness. By winter, the markets fell silent. The fig trees withered, though their roots still touched water. Goats were born blind. The temple of Tushara was closed, not by decree, but because the priests had vanished. Mosaics depicting saints and miracles adorned the newer churches, but they were laid over tombs now, not sanctuaries. Every icon watched over bones. A single street, once the artery of empire, saw no sandal prints. The wind became bolder. Sand swept in like judgment, whispering into doorways, burying thresholds. A mother wrote her daughter's name in ash on the wall before locking the door and walking away. She left the key beneath a jar of dates, untouched to this day. It wasn't a collapse. It was an exhale, long and drawn. Some families stayed longer, hoping the fever would pass. They marked their lintels with oil. They lit lanterns and sang psalms. They watched the stars for signs. But even the stars seemed quieter now, as if averting their gaze from this once chosen place. One man buried 12 children, and still swept his threshold every dawn. Then one day, he too was gone. The Byzantines came late. They built churches where temples once stood. They painted crosses over the old gods and called it renewal. But even the new saints could not banish the smell in the lower quarters. Not rot, but something older, like memory left too long in the dark. The fever had faded by then or found a new home, but its ghost remained. A dryness in the air that wine could not quench, a stillness that prayers could not stir. Pilgrims still came, but they left quickly. Traders avoided the place, muttering of cursed wells and children seen in dreams. Eventually, even the bishops left. The city did not fall in flames. It did not shatter. It simply became forgotten. One by one, the people vanished. Some left for Jerusalem, others for Damascus. Some walked into the desert, never seen again. They left behind their lamps, their letters, their lullabies. They left behind staircases that led to empty rooms, fountains that no longer sang. They left behind names, carved in Greek and Nabatean, names that once meant something and now sit beneath layers of dust like sleeping seeds. And so the miracle turned to myth. Today, Petra dazzles once more. Its facades, like frozen fire, draw thousands. Photographs are taken. Guides speak of Roman roads and Nabatean gods, of engineering and empire. The sun still rises over the treasury with a blaze that seems divine. But if you stand still long enough, alone in the deeper canyons, you might hear it. Not voices, not echoes, but something quieter. A dry whisper, a taste on the air like old parchment, a memory trying to speak through stone. The fever has no name, only its absence remains, of water, of people, of song. And perhaps that is the cruelest legacy of all. For a miracle forgotten is not simply lost, it is ungrieved. It began with no trumpet, no omen, no burning star in the sky, only silence. A long, drawn-out hush that settled over the highlands like a funeral veil, soft and lingering, untouched by the wind. In the cradle of stone and shadow, nestled among the jagged mountains of what we now call Ethiopia, the kingdom of Aksum once thrummed with life. It was not a kingdom of whispers and isolation then, but a thunderous pulse upon the ancient world. Its banners flickered over Red Sea winds. Its coins, stamped with crowns and crosses, found their way into the palms of merchants in far-off India and Byzantium. Obelisks rose toward the sun like prayers carved from granite, and beneath them, emperors ruled with the blood of Solomon in their veins, or so the legend whispered. Faith blossomed in this land. Christianity did not come as a conqueror, but as a pilgrim, slow and sacred, winding up the mountainous paths with scriptures wrapped in linen and breath scented with frankincense. Churches were not built. They were born from the very bones of the earth, hewn from living rock, each one a cathedral of silence. Stone sanctuaries where voices echoed against the walls like the memory of angels. But time, as ever, is a river that turns even mountains to mist. Something shifted after the 7th century, slowly, the kind of slowness that does not shake, but erodes. Not a fall, but a retreat. A dimming of the light behind shuttered windows. Traders stopped arriving. Gold no longer gleamed so bright upon the fingers of kings. The fields below the hills grew strange and hostile. The rains, once steady as scripture, faltered. Crops withered in the hands of farmers who no longer sang. There are no scrolls that mourn Aksum's quiet departure. No elegies carved into stone, just the stillness that came like dusk upon a temple courtyard, and bones. In the dry soil of the Aksumite necropolises, archaeologists unearthed more than royalty and regalia. They found twisted remains of children, their spines bowed as if bent beneath invisible burdens, jaws warped by starvation's grip, limbs swollen or shriveled, and lesions, dark crescents etched into ancient marrow, whispering of a sickness long forgotten. Not a single name for it has endured in song, but among scattered texts, a scholar once breathed the phrase, the red sickness. It was a blood plague, they say, thick as rust and quiet as breath. It did not roar into cities like Rome's pestilences, nor blacken the heavens like plague over Constantinople. It crept up from the lowlands, where the trade routes pulsed with life and wrought alike. Through the markets of Adulis, up the narrow escarpments, through the mountain passes, to the very heart of Axum, like a serpent winding toward warmth. It began with fevers, then bleeding, children coughing up threads of red, mothers who bled without wound, priests who fainted in the sanctuaries and never rose again. Still, there was no panic, only processions, incense thicker than usual, prayers that lingered longer in the dark. The faithful clung to liturgy while their breath grew thinner, their steps faltering. Axum did not scream. It did not burn its sick. It did not flee. It withdrew. It is said that emperors of old sealed the palace gates not in fear, but in reverence, believing this illness was not of the flesh alone, but a reckoning, a test, a whisper from God that silence was the only answer. One by one, the great structures emptied, not through war, not through fire, but through stillness. Fields became ash-gray plains of dust. The aqueducts ran dry, not broken, but unused, and the granite crosses stood alone beneath moonlight, as if waiting for footsteps that never returned. There is one tale, barely preserved, half legend, half hymn, of a child named Dawit. His family, minor nobles, once oversaw the incense trade, their courtyard thick with the scent of myrrh and warm milk. He was 7 when his mother first coughed blood onto the altar linen. He watched her die in pieces, first her laughter, then her strength, then her eyes. He did not cry. Instead, he climbed the hill behind their estate, every morning before dawn, and whispered her name to the wind, as if he could summon her soul back into the world. When the fever came for him, he did not call for his father. He walked, barefoot, gaunt, sunken, to the cathedral carved into the rock. He laid at the foot of the altar and waited, still as a stone offering. A monk found his body 3 days later. They say his face bore no pain, only peace, and that the candle at the altar, usually short-lived, burned without flickering until sunrise. Whether Dawit ever lived, no one knows. But his story lives in the cracks of that church, in the grooves worn smooth by the feet of the faithful who once gathered. The candles still burn there, no longer in multitudes, but one at a time, slowly, reverently. Today the churches of Axum remain, cold and eternal. They seem less built than summoned, like the mountain itself chose to remember. And in those stone walls, silence lingers like a psalm without end. You can almost hear it, if you stand still long enough, the last breath of an empire. No trumpets, no dirges, just the wind threading through empty corridors and the soft echo of sandals that no longer walk. Empires do not always fall with fury. Some dissolve like breath on a mirror. And when they do, the earth remembers, not with noise, but with stillness. And so Axum, carved into stone and history alike, waits, not for resurrection, but for remembrance. Its silence is not abandonment, it is grace. It is the hush that follows prayer, the pause after scripture, the final note of a hymn that once filled the heavens, now fading softly into sleep. It began in silence, not the peace of stillness, but the hush of breath stolen, a breath shed too long beneath clay ceilings, in rooms too close, where gods once whispered through ochre-painted skulls, but now fell mute beneath the weight of disease. In the cradle of the Konya plain, long before Babylon cast its ziggurats into the sky, before Ur traced law into stone, there pulsed a strange hive of human intimacy. Çatalhöyük, a place without streets, without doorways, homes pressed wall to wall like nesting wombs, their roofs the only path to moonlight. Every step overhead was a walk across another family's sky. To descend into one's dwelling was to pass through smoke and shadow, through a hole in the ceiling, into a sanctum of breath and bone. Here, life and death shared walls. Beneath sleeping mats, under fire pits, behind plastered benches, the dead lingered. Skulls of loved ones, sometimes strangers, rested within the home, painted, polished, preserved. The living spoke among the dead, dreamt with them underfoot, worshipped beside their femurs and fractured spines. This was not a city of strangers. This was a lineage, coiled in on itself, generation buried beneath generation, bone wrapped in intimacy. But toward the city's twilight, something shifted. It began with a quiet crescendo of the buried. Graves grew crowded. Infants, swaddled in linen and despair, were laid into the earth too soon and too often. In corners once reserved for reverence, bodies were pressed close, limb against limb, skull atop skull, as if the luxury of solitary rest had been lost. There was no time to build separate tombs, no space to grieve apart. They called it bone fever, though we do not know their word for it, only the silence it left behind. The lesions tell a whisper of the tale, etched into the bones like sorrow into wood. Tiny pockmarks along the vertebrae, signs of fluid drowned lungs, of a sickness that starved the marrow and seeped through shared breath. Tuberculosis, perhaps, or something else. Something birthed in the thickened air between bodies, too near, too many. Something that passed with a touch, a cough, a lullaby whispered in the night. Within the darkness of their packed homes, the fever feasted. It passed from mother to child as easily as warmth, clung to the sweat of laborers, clotted the lungs of the old. The homes, so brilliant in their ingenuity, so warm, so communal, had become wombs of contagion. Obsidian blades, once traded with the shimmer of power, now lay untouched beneath hearths that no longer glowed. The goddess figures, voluptuous, fertile, eternal, were found turned on their sides, their pigments faded, their altars cracked. Not broken in rage, but neglected, forgotten. The gods had stopped answering. No new paint was laid upon the skulls. No new carvings adorned the walls. Shrines collected dust rather than incense. The rituals, once thunderous with drums and trance, with dancing bodies and sacred offerings, waned to a murmur, then vanished altogether. It was not disbelief. It was exhaustion, the kind of tired that seeps into the soul when death no longer shocks, only waits patiently. And yet, Çatalhöyük did not fall in fire. No enemy marched through its ladders. No swords were drawn at its borders. There is no blackened ruin layer, no charred horizon. Instead, there is absence, a thinning of footprints, tools left in mid-use, half-finished walls abandoned. A migration not born of panic, but surrender. The people simply left. Some drifted east, some west. Others, no doubt, perished mid-journey, cradling fevered children beneath alien skies. The city emptied itself, like a wound slowly draining. The rooftops, once alive with footsteps and voices, grew quiet beneath wind and ash. Dust gathered where prayers once fell. The gods remained, but no longer for anyone. And what remains? What echoes in the silence? Walls of mud brick, still honeycombed. Bones nestled beneath old mats, their stories unread. Obsidian tools and goddess figurines scattered like forgotten dreams. Plastered skulls, their pigments faded, but still faintly visible. Red ochre tracing cheekbones, as if memory clung to them, even as breath did not. But more haunting still is the intimacy of their end. We are not meant to die in crowds. We are not meant to sleep above the dead or breathe the exhale of the sick. And yet, for 1,000 years, the people of Çatalhöyük did just that. They lived in closeness, in trust, in shared warmth. And it was this very closeness that undid them. Not war, not fire, but breath, damp air, walls without space between. A fever of love, of community, of too much togetherness. And perhaps that is the oldest warning of all. Not carved in stone, not sung in epic, but etched into the marrow, whispered in the silence of abandoned hearths. We too gather in cities. We too live above our dead, in buildings stacked, in quarters narrow. We too forget the air we share. Çatalhöyük does not speak, but its silence is not empty. It is the silence of breath, once shared and now stilled. The silence of rituals once sacred, now forsaken. The silence of a people who believed in togetherness, until togetherness became the ghost. And as wind moves through its ancient corridors, where no street ever ran, we might still hear it. A breathless hush, a fevered prayer, the final quiet exhale of a city that loved too closely. The black waters whisper still in the silence of the Indus plains. Long ago, when the world was young and the air hung heavy with the breath of gods, a city rose beside a river, not with the wild stones of conquerors or the sharp towers of kings, but with rhythm and reason, as if the very hands that shaped it obeyed the beat of the earth itself. Mohenjo-daro, they would one day call it, mound of the dead. But it did not begin in death. It began in balance. Here, where the bronze dawn spilled across the Sind, people built not for war, but for water. They channeled rivers with precision. Their homes aligned in grid-like stillness, each brick uniform, each step deliberate. It was as if geometry had become their gospel. Beneath the dusty sun, drains coiled through streets like veins, carrying waste away from the heart of the city. The great bath stood at its center, a temple not to flame or idol, but to purity itself. A sacred pool cut from stone, sealed with bitumen, where pilgrims bathed in the hopes of being washed clean of sorrow, grief, and sin. There were no emperors here, no monuments screaming a man's name into the wind, only silence, order, dignity, a civilization built, it seemed, on the very dream of harmony. But dreams, like rivers, change course. No scroll, no carved stone, no ancient tablet tells us what happened. Their language remains locked, a forest of glyphs no one alive can read. But the earth remembers. It cradled their bones for 4,000 years. And when men with picks and brushes came to wake the city from its slumber, they found not a ruin, but a ghost mid-breath. The dead lay as if they had been walking. Some clutched one another, heads turned toward home. There were no spear points, no burned timber, no toppled towers, no signs of siege or massacre, only stillness, as if the entire city had paused and never moved again. And then there was the water, the very system they had mastered, those drains, those wells, those flowing channels of life may have betrayed them. In time, the river shifted, the flow lessened. Wells once clear with the mountain's tears turned dark, their bottoms thick with rot. Stagnation crept in silence, cloaked in calm. Human waste, once so cleverly whisked away, began to linger. Pools became swamps, purity became poison. The bath remained, still and waiting. Some say the children were the first to fall. In the graveyard south of the city, hundreds of tiny bones lie curled like forgotten petals, their skulls cracked, not by violence, but by fever. The kind of sickness that rides the bloodstream, enteric, typhoid, the waterborne curse that does not shout, but whispers from within. Bone lesions suggest inflammation, prolonged pain, and desperate parents. Perhaps they prayed at the bath. Perhaps they wept in the dark, lighting small lamps by the edge of that sacred pool, begging the gods they never named to save their daughters, their sons, themselves. Perhaps they poured water over their heads, trying to cleanse what had already soaked into the blood. And then they too grew still. Was it drought? Did the skies dry up and leave the earth to crack like ancient parchment? Or was it flood, sudden, wrathful, burying all with the force of 10,000 storms? Some say the climate betrayed them. Others suggest a slow decay, a slow poisoning, unnoticed until it had seeped into every mouth, every child, every lung. Their greatest gift, sanitation, had become a labyrinth of shadows. What had once been their pride now carried the ghost of disease, slinking from one house to another like a serpent in clay. The bath, once warm with sunlight and laughter, grew cold. Algae thickened on its walls, the drains clogged with sludge. Ritual turned to desperation. The people left or died, or simply faded. No conqueror came, no fire claimed them, no god rode to the end, just water and silence. When archaeologists stepped into Mohenjo-Daro millennia later, they felt something different. Not ruin, but a city paused. Bricks still sat in neat lines, doorways yawned open, as if waiting for someone to return. The bath, cracked but proud, still held the rain. Some refused to descend into it. They said the air was wrong, that it hummed. And in the stillness, the questions grew louder. Why were the bodies found unburied? Some in the streets, some collapsed beside steps. Why did they die where they stood? And why had no one returned? One theory claims the people fled en masse, abandoning a city poisoned by its own brilliance. That a slow rot stole into their systems and sapped their strength until no one remained to sweep the floors, to scrub the bath, to sing the dawn songs. But others say the city still bathes, that the spirit of purification lingers in the great bath, trying forever to cleanse itself of the unseen plague. A ritual without end, a penance without closure, that when the monsoon winds come and rain pools briefly in the old stone basin, the water stirs not with breeze, but with memory. The language of Mohenjo-Daro has never been deciphered. Their script, all curves and lines and symmetrical secrets, sits mute on seal stones, on clay tablets, on the amulets that hung from children's necks. The thoughts of an entire people lie just out of reach. We do not know what they called their gods. We do not know what they feared. We do not know their last words. But we have their bricks, we have their silence, and we have their water, black in memory, still in spirit. They built for harmony, and in doing so, danced close to the fire of nature's balance. Too close, perhaps. When the river moved, when the water fouled, there was no one to answer. The systems they made were too intricate to undo, too vast to repair. What had been their triumph became their tomb. Even now, beneath the moonlight, the city sleeps on its mound. Desert wind winds through hollow courtyards. Clay pots lie shattered in kitchens no one remembers. The great bath waits, patient as time, carved from ancient hands that knew both reverence and pride. And if you listen, not with ears but with soul, you may hear the final ritual still unfolding. The city forever trying to cleanse itself of the curse it could not name. The black waters do not boil. They do not scream. They do not judge. They remember. They say that Avaris was born from the mouths of ships, not from the womb of sand like Memphis, nor from the bedrock carved by kings like Thebes. No, Avaris was conjured from the tide, from sails stretched with Levantine wind, from the salt that whispered foreign tongues into Egypt's eastern flank. The city rose not from conquest, but from commerce, and it shone with the glint of bronze mirrors and incense-burnt prayers to gods whose names the Nile did not yet know. But nothing built from sea foam stays whole. Salt preserves flesh and devours it. So listen closely now, in the hush of night, for Avaris lies beneath your breath, somewhere under the threshold of remembrance. And what sleeps beneath Pyrameses does not sleep peacefully. The eastern delta was a strange land, even to the Egyptians themselves. Marshland and reeds, mud brick and brackish water. But here, the Hyksos made their throne. Not invaders at first, merchants, wanderers, settlers, bringing tin and horses and stories from Canaan, from Byblos, from Hattusa's shadow. Over decades, they grew into rulers. And Avaris, their city, bloomed like a narcissus on the edge of a blackened floodplain. The streets bustled with dialects, like whetstones grinding together. Akkadian, Hurrian, Semitic prayers woven through Egyptian hymns. There were temples for Baal beside shrines to Hathor. Clay figurines with eyes too wide and altars burned in foreign fashion. But there was peace, a rare thing. Trade made it so. Timber came in from afar. Lapis lazuli rode on camelback. Avaris had become the eastern gate of empire. But even gates, left open too long, let in more than they bargained for. It began with silence. Not the silence of reverence or of night, but the uncanny hush of a market where no feet fall. No clatter of copper bowls, no goat bleats, just the distant creak of ropes swinging on anchored ships that had not been unloaded. The sailors had not come ashore. When priests were summoned to investigate, they found only rot, mouths blackened, eyes wide, lips cracked like parched earth. Men slumped across barrels of fish, and beneath their skin, blotches, swelling, heat. They smelled wrong, not of decay, but of something still alive, something blooming inside them. Soon, it was not just sailors. In Avaris, a mother buried 3 children before the moon could cycle. A scribe collapsed mid-inscription in the middle of Baal's name. A high priestess of Anat was found convulsing, foam at her lips, still gripping the hand of her youngest acolyte. The city that had sung in 10 tongues was now filled with only one, the gurgling rasp of the fevered. And from the Nile, the ibis did not return. The graves came fast, but not well. There were too many. No time for the weighing of hearts, for oils and wrappings, for the tongue to be cut from the dead so they could not curse the living. The Hyksos buried them wherever the ground would give, behind homes, beside altars, beneath doorways. Children buried their parents, and then, in the same afternoon, were buried themselves. The rites grew rushed, erratic. Some dead were placed on reed mats soaked in wine, others were burned in shallow pits, while priests chanted broken words. The Book of the Dead was abandoned. There was only one text now, the sound of coughing in the dark. Some say it was cholera, others a plague born of stagnant water and the mixing of too many peoples too quickly. But there were whispers, lower, darker, that it was punishment, that the gods of Egypt had turned their gaze from the city of strangers, that Ra's light had dimmed in the east because it no longer recognized the names cried out in worship, that Set, Chaos himself, had come to reclaim the mingled city. The sickness moved like shadow, not in straight lines, not bound by reason. A nobleman's house might be spared, while beggars 2 doors down were found stacked like firewood. Sacred cows collapsed mid-milk. Horses foamed at the nostrils. Even the cats, divine and feared, slunk off and never returned. Then one morning, the Pharaoh's men arrived. They came not to heal, not with poultices or amulets or prayers, but with fire, with decree. The Hyksos were to be expelled, not merely cast out, erased, their temples defaced, their language scrubbed from stone, their gods were declared false. Avarice was sealed, locked beneath edict and fear. Some fought, most fled, south to Canaan, west to dust. The city was abandoned to the fevered, to the howling sick, whose limbs could not carry them beyond the gates. And those gates were bricked closed. Avarice disappeared beneath layers of silt and time. The Nile turned its face. Later, kings built over it, stamping their names on stone to overwrite memory. Pyramids rose, bright and proud, as if nothing had ever stood before it, as if the screams had never echoed across the reeds. But stone remembers. In the 20th century, long after even the pharaohs had turned to dust, men digging beneath Tanis and Kontir uncovered strange ruins. Too deep, too foreign, bodies buried in positions that defied Egyptian custom. Mass graves where no ceremony had touched them. Traces of infection in ancient bone. Jawlines locked mid-agony. Finger bones curled like claws. And even deeper still, below the city's edge, they found amulets to foreign gods. Baal, Anat, Resheph, god of plague and war. As if the city itself had cried out in desperation, had clung to whatever names would hear it. But no gods came. Now, in the silence of the buried holes, in the shallow ribs of homes half-eaten by earth, Avarice sleeps. The air beneath holds no sound but dust shifting on stone. But if you close your eyes, really close them, you might hear the breath of the sick, trapped in eternity, still waiting for the door to open. There is no monument for avarice, no hymn, no festival, only sand and the bones of those who died without names, without rites, without the weight of a soul's proper goodbye. Sometimes, history is not erased with violence. Sometimes, it is simply left to rot. And in that rot, myths bloom. So tread softly, listener, for beneath the quiet of Egypt's eastern delta, beneath fields of papyrus and the hum of frogs at dusk, the ghost of a city watches still, It does not move, it does not speak, but it remembers. And in the dark, memory is its own kind of sickness. The wind does not forget. Long after the footsteps fade, long after the drums fall silent, and the kiva fires turn cold, the wind still moves across the mesas, through the broken doorways, whispering prayers in a tongue no longer heard. It weeps where voices once echoed in ceremony and grief. It remembers. And in the quiet of the canyon night, beneath a harvest moon, drained pale with time, it tells the story of those who vanished with reverence. High in the dry, aching altitudes of the American Southwest, the ancestral Puebloans built their cities not from dreams but from stone. They raised walls from sandstone and sky, nesting their lives in alcoves cut by centuries of wind and water. Mesa Verde, Chaco Canyon, towers like sundials and spiral petroglyphs that sang to the solstices. They did not write with ink. They wrote with shadow and light. For over 600 years, they thrived. Corn grew in stepped terraces coaxed from stubborn soil. Kivas, round sacred chambers, yawned open to the underworld, places where the veil between ancestors and the living grew thin. Community pulsed like a heartbeat beneath the cliffs, marked by ritual, trade, and the rhythm of rain. But the rain began to fail, first a trickle of years, then a silence that settled into the bones. Drought gripped the land with a cruel fist. What little water remained sank deeper into the earth, beyond reach. Crops withered under an unforgiving sun. Granaries, once rich with maize and squash, grew hollow, yet they stayed. They stayed longer than one might expect, longer than comfort could justify. They adapted, built reservoirs, diversified crops, held dances, offered prayers. But the earth did not relent. And then something else came. Quieter, deadlier. Not fire, not war, but breath. In the crevices of those majestic cliff dwellings, something unseen began to move. It came on tiny feet, on the dry droppings of deer mice that scurried through storerooms and nestled near food. Perhaps it was hantavirus, modern scholars whisper, a disease hidden in the dust. Or perhaps something older still, a hunger in the air, a fever passed mouth to mouth, cough to cough, within stone walls that once protected and now imprisoned. The signs linger in the bones. Skeletal remains, excavated with trembling care, show lesions, not from violence, but from sickness. Skulls thinned by malnutrition, yes, but also marked by infection. In cramped quarters, families breathed the same heavy air. Children slept beside elders. The sacred kivas, once places of life and myth, became echoes of final gatherings where chants might have mingled with the first ragged coughs. They did not flee in panic. There is no evidence of a violent exodus, no overturned altars, no burnt dwellings. Instead, what remains is ceremony. Tools laid down as if for return, hearths swept, kivas sealed with stone and soil, as though the people knew this was not abandonment but passage, as if the spirits had been released. And silence was now more sacred than song. By the close of the 13th century, they were gone. Chaco's roads, once stretching like the sun's fingers across the desert, fell to dust. The cliff palaces of Mesa Verde stood hollow, watching over canyons no longer filled with laughter or lament. And still, the wind moved, carrying the last breath of 1,000 forgotten farewells. Their descendants live in the pueblos of the Hopi, Zuni, and modern-day Puebloan tribes. The stories remain, carried in corn pollen and prayer sticks, in dances that mimic the turning of stars. They do not speak of a fall, only of a journey, a migration guided by the spirits, a movement toward balance, toward water, toward survival. The old places are not ruins to them. They are memories. They are maps. But what truly happened in those final years? The wind does not say. Perhaps, as the springs dried and food grew scarce, rivalries flared. Perhaps hunger cracked the delicate balance of kinship and sharing. Walls were built higher, entryways narrower, defensive, suspicious. A people turning inward, seeking safety not in community, but in isolation. And in such isolation, diseases flourish. The breath of one becomes the burden of all. Or perhaps it was grief, a slow erosion of hope. When the rains do not come and the stars offer no guidance, even the strongest traditions falter. Imagine a mother, her child fevered in her arms, staring out from the stone window of a cliff, dwelling into the red dusk. Imagine her prayers falling to dust, her offerings unanswered. Would she too leave a sealed kiva behind her? Would she believe, as her ancestors once did, that the spirit of the place must be protected, even in its abandonment? Even the silence here feels sacred. It wraps around the doorways like old bark. It nestles in the mortar. It fills the stairwells carved into vertical cliffs. The silence does not accuse. It mourns. It watches. And so we, centuries removed, stand at the edge of crumbling walls and try to hear what was never written. We trace the grooves of stone tools, touch the soot of hearths long cooled. We speak of famine, drought, epidemic. We build theories from bones. But the people themselves, their breath, their laughter, their laments, have drifted into legend. Perhaps that is fitting. Some stories are not meant to be solved. Some are meant to be remembered in fragments, in windswept echoes, in dreams beneath desert stars. The cliff dwellings remain caught in golden light at dusk, as if still inhabited by memory. Even now, if you walk alone through the canyon when the moon is low and the juniper trees shiver, you might feel it. Not fear, but reverence. As though you've stepped into the afterimage of something vast and intimate. The stones of Delphi once shimmered with the breath of prophecy, the mountain air thick with the secrets of kings and the riddles of gods. But now, all is quiet. The wind, once carrying divine utterances, moves only dust. The omphalos, the navel of the world, lies still. And in the dark hollow beneath the temple of Apollo, no voice answers the faithful. The last breath has been drawn. They say it began not with silence, but with fire. The temple sat nestled in the high cliffs of Mount Parnassus, its marble columns catching the first light of dawn like ivory spears aimed toward heaven. Pilgrims climbed from the olive valleys below, their hands clasped in trembling hope, their eyes heavy with dreams. From Persia and Carthage, from Rome and tiny Ionian islands, they came. They brought offerings, coins, garlands, statues of bronze and gold. But what they sought could not be weighed. Answers, fate, permission, redemption. At the center of it all was the Pythia, the oracle, seated above a chasm in the earth, her body cloaked in white, her breath mingling with the sacred vapors that seeped from the rock. Her voice did not belong to her. It belonged to Apollo. When she opened her mouth, the world held its breath. But in the year the voices changed, the air itself grew wrong. Roman scribes note the shift without understanding it. The sweet scent that once drifted through the Adyton, that secret chamber beneath the temple floor, turned bitter. A sourness clung to the walls. The pilgrims kept coming. They could not know the god was receding. At first, the oracle's visions grew more wild, more erratic. She thrashed as if gripped by unseen hands, her riddles fragmented, disjointed, no longer poetic, but fractured like broken pottery. Some believed it was a sign that Apollo had been angered, that mankind's arrogance had finally worn thin the veil between reverence and blasphemy. But others saw the fever. One by one, the attendants began to fall ill. A boy tasked with pouring libations collapsed during the morning rites. A priest went blind within a fortnight. Then came the fits, violent, unrelenting, like seizures cast from the underworld itself. The afflicted howled, clawed at their flesh, and raved in voices not their own. Some whispered it was Dionysus reclaiming the temple, sending madness in wine-soaked waves. But it was not wine. It was not God. The land itself seemed sick. The rocks were warm to the touch. Springs that once flowed clear now bubbled with strange heat. The birds stopped nesting in the crevices. The cypress trees along the path grew brittle. Something ancient was shifting beneath, something the eye could not see. And still, the Pythia descended. Her name has been lost, perhaps Marine, perhaps Theoclia. But her end was recorded in the trembling script of a Roman scribe posted to Achaia. He wrote of her final trance, the day she inhaled the vapors with greater desperation than ever before. The gods had grown distant, her voice had grown small, and so she opened her lungs wide, hoping to find divinity in the depths of the cave. What emerged was not prophecy. Witnesses claimed she screamed until blood sprayed from her mouth. Her eyes rolled back, her limbs contorted. She choked, convulsed, and then silence. The priests stood motionless, as if frozen by the horror. When they moved to touch her, her skin was cold, her jaw still stretched in that last open cry, as though the god had fled her mid-sentence and left her hollow. Whispers spread like ash. Some blamed Rome. The empire, ever devouring, had offended the sacred order. Others looked beneath their feet to the fissures that had widened, the heat that rose even in moonlight. Later minds would blame ethylene, the invisible breath of stone. But at the time, all they knew was death. The fever did not stop with her. It crept through the temple grounds, through guest quarters, into town. Those who tended to the oracle, those who cleaned the floors, who touched the statues, they withered. One elder priest, it said, walked into the woods and never returned. Another burned every scroll in the inner sanctum before casting himself into the Pleistos River. He said the god had left, and the words meant nothing now. And then, as if following a funeral procession, silence came to stay. The temple remained, its beauty unmarred for a time, its pillars gleaming in the sun like the ribs of a sleeping giant. But no pilgrims came. No answers were sought. The sacred fire went out, unattended. Dust collected in the corners. Owls nested in the colonnades. And the omphalos, once kissed by generations, grew cold as tombstone. No more riddles, no more fate. They say the god's voice still echoes deep within the cavern, too soft for mortal ears, speaking only to the stone and the shadows. But even that is a kindness. What lingers more truly is the absence, the aching vacuum where the sacred once breathed. Today, the tourists walk those marble paths with cameras and maps, feet treading where barefoot pilgrims once knelt. They peer into the dark recess of the temple, past the ropes and placards, into the mouth of the earth. But the cave does not speak. The god does not answer. There are no riddles here, only ruin. Beneath the surface, the gases still stir, faint and without purpose. The rock still holds its secrets, coiled like ancient serpents in the dark. But the oracle is gone, her breath spent, her voice scattered like ash across the Parnassian winds. In the hush of midnight, if you place your ear to the cold stones of Delphi, you might still feel it. The pulse of a world that once believed the future could be known, spoken, shaped. A world that listened to a woman possessed not by... They call it the desert of no return. A basin of wind-whipped silence, where even the sun seems afraid to linger too long. The Taklamakan, a name that rustles like dry silk through the annals of forgotten time, hides its secrets beneath a skin of gold and death, and here, beneath dunes that roll like the backs of ancient beasts, sleep the mummies of the Tarim Basin. Wrapped in salt, wool, and sorrow, they have waited 4,000 years for someone to ask why. Their eyes are closed, but not in peace. Their lips do not smile, though they once sang. Some lie with children curled in their arms, others stretched beside baskets of grain, tools, combs, and hope. And each face, though still and quiet, whispers of something unfinished, as though the moment between breath and silence was caught and preserved by the desert itself, a hush that became eternal. They are strange sleepers, hair like flax and fire, high cheekbones, narrow noses, garments of plaid wool, and soft felt boots. Not of this place, not of this land of red dust and camel bones. Yet here they are, men, women, children, frozen in time among the salt-crusted sands of Western China, far from where such faces are expected. As if the desert had opened her arms to an alien people and swallowed them whole. The scientists call them the Tarim mummies, but to speak their name is to awaken something heavier, the burden of a mystery too old to resolve. These were not warriors fallen in battle, not kings buried beneath pyramids. They were travelers, migrants, perhaps even dreamers, led by caravans and the glint of early trade along the Silk Road before it had earned its name. They moved with livestock and memory, carrying stories that no longer have mouths to tell them. And one by one, they died. Some graves are ordered, neat, the dead laid with offerings, heads turned west, as if listening to the last echo of a homeland long behind them. Others are not. Children lie beside adults with no sign of ritual or rhythm. Some are buried with haste, their bodies wrapped hurriedly, their faces twisted mid-final breath. No trauma, no violence, just an urgency, as though death had come too fast to arrange anything else. The bodies are so well preserved, it feels wrong to call them corpses. Their skin is tanned and tight, their eyes sunken but intact, their hair still braided, still blonde. Their garments are not torn, their shoes still soft. You could imagine them simply asleep, and some say that is how death claimed them. Not with screams or blood, but in silence, a sleep too deep to break. But what ended them? The desert holds no plague pits, no collapsed shelters, no signs of war, and yet, beneath the sands, more and more of them lie, dozens at first, then hundreds, like stars swallowed by the firmament of salt. Many of their bodies suggest the same sorrow. Rapid decline, preserved too perfectly for rot, too many dead in too short a time. There are no bite marks, no blades, no smoke, just the sense of something invisible moving among them. Some speak now in cold white labs of viruses, not of modern strain, but ancient, a zoonotic sickness born in livestock, a red death passed from beast to hand, from hand to mouth, until it touched everyone. A hemorrhagic fever, perhaps, the kind that liquefies the blood and silences the body before dawn, the kind that moves not in screams, but in stillness, that kills not in battle, but in sleep. And so we imagine them, a mother stoking a fire that never catches, a child coughing softly in the night, a man pressing a cool cloth to a trembling forehead. One by one, the fever whispers its lullaby, and one by one, they fall. There are those who believe it was not one death, but many, that they did not all perish in a single season, but wave after wave, the sick buried by the not yet sick, until the grave diggers themselves fell still. A slow vanishing, a long forgetting, as though the desert itself demanded their return, not all at once, but over time, until the last of them lay down with eyes closed, hands folded, lips parted, and never woke. And through it all, the Taklamakan said nothing. Its winds howled, but not in grief. Its dunes shifted, but not to mark graves. It did what deserts do. It kept the silence. Even now, when their bodies are uncovered, there is a hush. Archaeologists in sun hats and masks kneel like mourners, brushing away dust as though disturbing the sleep of gods. The air trembles with reverence. You do not raise your voice among the dead here. You do not speak of answers, only questions, only awe. For what is death when it leaves no violence behind? What is a plague that paints no horror, only sleep? The Red Death, some whisper, not named for blood spilled, but for the flush of fever, the flicker of heat before the end. A ghost that drifted into campfires and cradles alike. A breath from the animals they fed. A silence stitched into the seams of wool tunics and the bellies of goats. A death you cannot see until you too are lying down, too tired to move, too warm to wake. And still they lie there, the dead of the Tarim, beneath the sand and the stars. Eyes closed, hair golden in the candlelight of archaeologists' lamps. No tombs, no scrolls, just flesh and cloth and the endless hush of the desert. Sometimes, when the wind rises and the moon hangs low, it is easy to imagine them as watchers, not dead, but waiting for the rest of us to understand the lesson we keep missing. That silence is not the absence of meaning. That stillness is not peace. That there are deaths which arrive not as violence, but as surrender. And that even these must be remembered. And so the Red Death sleeps with them still, in every fold of linen, in every salted strand of hair, in every basket of seeds never planted, not screaming, not haunting, only waiting, waiting in the hush of the sand, in the salt, in the sleep. The breath of death does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers. It was a summer like any other on the Bay of Naples. Light dappled the marble columns, laughter echoed from the courtyards, and children chased each other down alleyways polished smooth by centuries of sandal-worn passage. But beneath this life, the earth stirred. Not in fury, not yet, but in sickness. A silent malaise curled from the roots of the mountain, seeping into the aquifers, coiling into the wells, rising like an invisible mist into the air. The people of Herculaneum were used to Vesuvius, a sleeping god, dark with promise, brooding behind their daily rhythms. They honored him in shrine and story, but they had never heard his voice, not truly, not the way their ancestors once feared. It had been too long. He had been quiet. And so, when the nausea came, when the dizziness visited the old men, when the dogs grew agitated in the night, and the wells began to smell of rotten eggs, they blamed it on the heat, or the sea air, or some god's passing whim. But the mountain was exhaling. Long before the sky turned black, before the flames gushed from heaven and ash made day into dusk, Herculaneum began to die. Slowly, softly, like a candle starved of oxygen. Beneath the tiled floors and painted ceilings, veins of arsenic trickled into the water. Hydrogen sulfide, silent and scentless in its early stages, drifted through open windows. People grew pale, some vomited, others collapsed with no cause. And still, life went on. They dressed in silks and feasted on honey-roasted figs. They visited the baths and traced gossip across warm marble. But behind their eyes, something ancient stirred, a fog behind the mind, a tightening in the lungs. Some sensed it, not in words, but in instinct. The fishmonger's wife who stopped drinking from the cistern. The centurion who could not sleep for weeks, plagued by a pressure in his chest he could not name. The child who refused to enter the basement, crying at nothing. But there were no warnings, no proclamations, only unease. And so the city breathed in, and the mountain waited. On the morning of August 24th, 79 CE, it began. But not here, not yet. From across the bay in Pompeii, a thunderous crack, a pillar of blackness climbing into the heavens, a plume that devoured the sky. The world tilted. Birds fell mid-flight. Shadows ran from the sun. And still, in Herculaneum, there was no fire. There was breath. A warm wind, wrong in its texture, wrong in its weight, swept in from the sea. The air grew thick, not with smoke, but with something denser, heavy, muffled. The wind that sings before a storm, but with no storm to follow. And then came the sounds, groans from deep below, as if the earth itself mourned. Fountains hissed. The sea pulled back, slow and deliberate, revealing rocks no man had seen in living memory. And still, there was no fire. They fled to the boathouses, not for protection. Not at first, but because of the suffocation. They thought the caves near the shoreline, cool and damp, might relieve the pressure in their lungs, the stinging in their eyes. Families huddled together, crammed in darkness, waiting for clarity, for orders, for some divine sign. But clarity would never come. Only silence. Later, the scholars would say they died before the fire, that the gases reached them first. Carbon dioxide, dense and low-lying, crept along the ground like a second tide. Hydrogen sulfide, heavier still, pooled in the hollows. And then came the heat. A pyroclastic surge, a wall of ash and vapor moving faster than a scream, incinerated flesh, vaporized bone. But the postures of the dead tell a deeper tale. They were already gone. Some lay in repose, their faces calm, their limbs unfurled as if sleeping. Others curled around each other, not in terror, but in an aching, helpless kind of love. A mother's arms around two children, a man with his hand still pressed to his mouth, as if shushing the void. No burns, no blisters, just stillness, the kind that comes when the lungs no longer draw, when the air turns against you. Above them, the city froze. Stone tables still bore bread. Wine jugs sat half-emptied on terracotta counters. Mosaic floors gleamed beneath the weight of ash, untouched by panic. The scrolls in the villa of the papyri, once blackened but intact, tell no stories of chaos, only sudden stillness. It was as though time itself bowed its head mid-sentence, mid-step. In the centuries that followed, Herculaneum was forgotten. Pompeii became the tale, vivid, flamboyant, dramatic in its suffering. But Herculaneum lingered beneath the stone like a whispered curse. Unruined by flames, unshouted by survivors, it lay dreaming beneath 30 meters of hardened mud. The breath of death had sealed it away. And now? Now we walk through those frozen corridors. We tiptoe through the remnants of a sigh. We stare at the curled fingers of those who did not burn. We listen not for screams, but for silence. And the silence speaks. It tells us that not all endings roar, that some cities die in their sleep, that the earth, before it screams, sometimes whispers. It tells us that danger does not always come in flame and fury, but in stillness, in breath, in the invisible hand that closes the throat and steals the sun. Herculaneum is not a monument. It is a breath, held too long, a moment suspended between life and myth, a death too quiet to be remembered, too sacred to be forgotten. So listen, when the wind feels wrong, when the air grows heavy and the wells grow sour, when the birds do not sing. Listen not just with ears, but with bone, with blood, with memory, for the earth does not always shout. Sometimes it only sighs. And that sigh may be the last sound you ever hear. They say the jungle never forgets. But in the deep silence of Mexico's Gulf Coast, where vines hang heavy like the locks of forgotten gods and insects whisper in the dark, something has been erased. A hush so complete, so unnatural, that even the wind dares not disturb the ancient stones. And yet, beneath that hush, there is a pulse, a memory, the breath of a people who once sang to jaguar spirits and carved colossal heads from mountain rock, their eyes unblinking, fixed on a horizon that would one day forget their names. These were the Olmec. Before the rise of Maya astronomy and Aztec conquest, there was San Lorenzo, La Venta, Tres Zapotes, cities of ritual and reverence, their plazas once alive with color, incense, and ceremony. The Olmec did not just live, they sculpted their myths into permanence. 12-ton basalt heads rose from their vision, features broad and calm, lips closed as if guarding something sacred. They gave us the earliest echoes of Mesoamerican civilization, a drumbeat in the dawn of time. And then, between one sunrise and the next, they began to vanish. There were no wars etched into the soil, no enemy banners flown, no desperate last stand, just an unraveling. Like the slow extinguishing of a great candle, one city dimmed, then another, until the jungle reclaimed it all, root by root, vine by vine. And the colossal heads, they remained wide-eyed, watching, waiting. The rivers were always lifeblood, the Coatzacoalcos, the Tonala. These winding serpents fed the people and gave rise to their cities. The Olmec knew how to harness water. Their canals were precise, ceremonial centers aligned to the stars. But nature, like gods grown jealous, does not stay tamed. In time, the rivers turned against them. Rain fell too long, too hard. Fields once cold with maize became stagnant pools, brown and bloated. The wetlands widened. Swamps crept into the plazas. Water stopped moving, stopped breathing. And when water dies, other things are born. The fever came quietly. No fanfare, no prophecy. Just a heaviness in the limbs, a night sweat, a chill that moved through bone like fog through a broken temple. Children whimpered, mothers dipped cloth in cool bowls, not knowing the water itself bore the curse. Mosquitoes rose in clouds, bred in the still pools. What once fed them now betrayed them. The gods were not silent. Not yet. The shamans cast cacao and obsidian, read the veins of maize leaves. They spoke in tongues under the smoky light of copal. But the signs turned cruel. Jaguar spirits, once protectors, now whispered warnings. The six spoke of shadow jaguars in their dreams, great beasts with burning eyes and fetid breath. Some claimed they saw them pacing outside the huts at night, paws silent in the mud. Flesh swelled, legs and arms thickened grotesquely, twisted by a sickness unseen. Some say it was a parasite, filariasis, the serpent worm of the blood. Others, a ghost sickness from the swamp. But whatever its name, it was relentless. It took slowly, lingering like regret. No plague of fire, no swift reaping. Just a long, smothering erosion. The priests brought offerings to the altars, jaguar pelts, carved masks, red shells, but the gods no longer answered. The sacred ball courts lay empty. The dancers, too weak to move, watched mold grow on their headdresses. Statues of half-man, half-beast cracked in the damp. Even the stone grew tired. Some fled, toward higher ground, toward cleaner streams. But the fever followed. It clung to their blood. It waited in their sleep. The Olmec did not vanish all at once. Number they dimmed, like embers in wet ash. In time, the colossal heads stopped appearing. These monoliths, each one carved from mountains and dragged for miles, were not merely art. They were guardians, ancestors, watchers of time. And when the hands that shaped them faltered, when the fever took the sculptors, the heads ceased. The basalt fell silent. There are whispers that the final head was carved in secret. A fevered sculptor, blind in one eye, driven by dreams not his own. He worked by moonlight, sweating and mumbling, shaping stone with blistered palms. When they found him, he was cold, slumped against the cheek of the god face he had made. The head was smaller than the others, the eyes deeper. It looked not outward, but downward, as if mourning something lost beneath the earth. By 300 BCE, the jungle had begun its slow feast. Walls crumbled beneath creeping vines, mosaics faded. Sacred jade was buried beneath layers of silt and silence. The Olmec heartland, once the cradle of gods, was swallowed. But memory is a stubborn root. Centuries later, when the Maya looked to the stars and the Aztecs spoke of Quetzalcoatl, echoes of the Olmec still stirred in the myths, in the jaguar gods, in the masks worn at ceremony, in the sacred notion that stone, when shaped with reverence, can hold a soul. Archaeologists today sift through bones and ruins. They find signs, waterborne parasites in the marrow, deformities in the legs, silent scars of an illness that once moved like mist through cities of stone. But science is only one language. The jungle speaks another. When you walk the abandoned plazas of La Venta, the ground is soft. The air is heavy with memory. Cicadas call from the trees like lost voices. And always, always, the heads are watching. Their lips are closed, their eyes wide, as if waiting for someone to speak the last rites, as if listening for the fever's end. And perhaps, in some midnight bygone time, when the air is still and the moon shines like bone, the jaguar gods will return, not in wrath, but in mourning, to sit beside the stone faces, to whisper the names that have long been forgotten, to honor a people who built cities in the breath of rivers and vanished not with a roar, but with a sigh. It begins with silence, a silence so vast it could smother the stars. Where once there were screams of chariots and drums carved from the skin of conquest, now there is only dust, dust and the wind whispering along the bones of shattered ziggurats. Nineveh, the lion-hearted jewel of Assyria, lies still beneath moonlight. Once it sang with fire and law and blood, a city that chained empires and catalogued the heavens. Its library held the tongues of gods, the secrets of storms, the naming of stars. Its kings wrote histories with iron, burnt cities into the horizon, and carved edicts deeper than time. But in the end, the clay crumbled. In the summer of 612 BCE, beneath a sky bruised with ash and war, Nineveh's heart stuttered. Babylon rose in wrath. The Medes came with vengeance, woven into their war banners. And the city's enemies did not come alone. Some say that famine bloomed in the heat, like a flower of rot. Others speak of shadows curling through the alleyways before the first siege tower touched stone. The walls of Nineveh, thick enough to turn arrows into whispers, stood firm. Its gates, bronze-skinned and sharp with spell and blade, did not yield. But something inside began to tremble. Cuneiform tablets, those eternal witnesses of civilization, end mid-sentence. One reads, "In the 4th year of the reign, the..." And then nothing. Not a smudge, not a stroke, just the void. Beneath shattered rooftops, archaeologists found skeletons curled in fetal repose, not slain by sword or arrow, but as if drawn into sleep they could not awaken from. Food remained on plates, bowls of lentils untouched, water still sealed in clay jars. No signs of burning in those first homes, no signs of violence, just silence and dust, and bodies folded into corners like children hiding from a storm. In the priest's quarters near the temple of Ishtar, an ossuary was uncovered. Small bones, infant bones, curled together like fallen sparrows. No blade had cut them. No fire had kissed their flesh. Yet they lay there, limbs locked in final prayers. Some blame dysentery, born of fouled wells and siege-starved bellies. Others speak of typhus clinging to the linen robes of holy men. But there are tablets, not many, only fragments, that speak of omens, of a dark heat moving through the temple halls, of sacrifices that were offered and found unworthy, of dreams where the gods turned their faces away and would not answer. In one barely decipherable, a scribe writes, "The queen does not rise. The sky is full of blood, and the crows no longer leave. No date, no signature. The edges of the clay flake like old skin, and the words themselves seem reluctant to remain." Perhaps it was famine, perhaps it was plague, or perhaps it was something older. Something summoned, something buried in the vaults of that legendary library, whose shelves once groaned with the names of demons and stars alike. The Assyrians had words for conquest, for sacrifice, for madness. They wrote of eclipses and omens with divine clarity. But for this undoing, they left only gaps. And then came the fire. The gates broke. Babylon poured in, not into a living city, but into a mausoleum dressed in empire's robes. The halls of kings were already empty. The thrones bore no witness. What remained were echoing corridors lined with crumbled books and bones. The invaders looted what they could, set fire to what remained. Nineveh burned, but it was already hollow. It is said the library of Ashurbanipal, that sacred grove of clay, glowed for 3 nights straight, not with flame, but with a strange pale light, as if the tablets themselves mourned. When dawn came, the roof had collapsed, burying knowledge not yet known, names not yet spoken, cures not yet written. It has taken centuries, to unearth only pieces of it. And even now, the translators often stop mid-line, staring at passages that end with no warning, as if the hands that wrote them were plucked away by unseen wind. There is no final account of Nineveh's death. No scribe remained to carve the tale. Only fragments, only questions. The silence is louder than any chronicle. And yet, beneath that silence, the earth remembers. When rain falls on the mounds of Nineveh today, it runs red with ancient clay. The soil bleeds memory. Shepherds still pass its ruins, whispering prayers they do not understand, tracing the outlines of broken reliefs with trembling fingers. The stars that Assyrian astronomers once named still shine above. But who now recalls the names they gave? In dreams, the city still breathes. Its libraries flicker with torchlight. Its gardens bloom, fed by aqueducts, long turned to dust. Children chase each other past palaces where kings once judged the world. And then, the silence comes. The dream ends. Sometimes, in sleep, you might find yourself walking those ancient streets. You might hear a voice, low, rough like sand and sorrow, reading from a tablet lost to time. You won't understand the words. They are older than language, but they are heavy with longing. For Nineveh does not sleep. It waits. Beneath the dust and rubble, beneath the blood and burnt stone, it listens, not for vengeance, not for resurrection, but simply to be remembered.